Hey, I'm Austin. In this episode, I'm breaking down some of the most brutal animal attacks in U.S. history. From a surfer paddling into Great White Territory in Northern California, to a Yellowstone tourist ignoring ranger warnings for a photo and stepping straight into a lethal grizzly charge, these stories prove how fast nature turns deadly. It was September 19, 2016, and the crisp mountain air carried the scent of changing leaves as Catherine Morrison prepared for her evening enrichment routine at her bear sanctuary, nestled in the foothills near Gatlinburg, Tennessee. The 34-year-old heiress had inherited a pharmaceutical fortune that allowed her to pursue her passion for wildlife rescue, establishing what she believed was a model facility for rehabilitating black bears on her 150-acre mountain property. The sanctuary housed 3 rescued bears in spacious enclosures designed to mimic their natural habitat, while providing the security necessary for animals that could never be returned to the wild. Kate had grown up surrounded by privilege, but had always felt drawn to conservation work, using her inheritance to create what she envisioned as a more humane alternative to traditional wildlife management. She had obtained the necessary permits and consulted with wildlife biologists during the facility's construction, but her philosophical differences with standard safety protocols had led to increasing tensions with her professional advisors. Kate believed that her gentle approach and daily interactions with the bears created bonds that transcended the animal's wild nature. The sanctuary's star resident was Bella, a 300-pound female black bear who had been rescued as an orphaned cub 3 years earlier after her mother was killed by poachers. Kate had personally bottle-fed Bella during her early months and maintained daily contact throughout the bear's development into a powerful adult. The approaching autumn had triggered Bella's natural preparation for winter hibernation, a process that dramatically altered the bear's behavior and dietary needs. What Kate didn't realize was that her consulting biologist had specifically warned against any direct contact during this critical period, but the message had been buried in a lengthy email that Kate had only skimmed while traveling to a conservation conference in Colorado. Kate's daily routine with Bella had become almost ritualistic over the past 3 years. With the heiress spending hours each day observing and interacting with the bear, she considered her greatest success story. She had documented Bella's progress extensively, creating photo albums and video journals that she planned to use for fundraising presentations to other wealthy philanthropists. Kate's confidence in her methods had grown to the point where she regularly dismissed the concerns of her professional staff, believing that her emotional connection with the animals provided insights that formal training could never match. The sanctuary had recently passed a state inspection with only minor recommendations, but the inspector had specifically noted concerns about Kate's hands-on approach during the fall feeding season. Kate had assured the inspector that she understood the risks, but maintained that her personal relationship with each bear allowed her to recognize warning signs that others might miss. Her staff had grown increasingly uncomfortable with her practices, but Kate's financial control over the facility made it difficult for anyone to challenge her decisions directly. American black bears are highly intelligent omnivores that can weigh up to 600 pounds, with females being particularly focused on caloric intake during the fall months leading to hibernation. During this period, known as hyperphagia, bears enter an intense feeding phase where they can consume up to 20,000 calories per day to build the fat reserves necessary for surviving winter dormancy. This biological imperative makes bears extremely food aggressive and unpredictable, as their survival instincts override all other considerations, including familiarity with human caretakers. Kate's decision to personally deliver seasonal enrichment items to Bella's enclosure reflected her hands-on management philosophy. Despite repeated warnings from her consulting biologist about the dangers of entering bear enclosures during hyperphagia, she had successfully conducted similar enrichment activities throughout the spring and summer months, placing toys, treats, and environmental stimulation items that kept Bella mentally engaged. Kate's confidence in her relationship with the bear had grown with each successful interaction, leading her to dismiss the seasonal behavioral changes as temporary mood shifts. The fatal encounter began when Kate entered Bella's enclosure carrying a basket filled with pumpkins, apples, and other seasonal treats, designed to provide mental stimulation and nutritional variety. Bella had been resting in the shade of a large oak tree but immediately focused on Kate's arrival, her powerful sense of smell detecting the food items from across the enclosure. The bear's approach seemed normal at first, matching the casual interest she had shown during previous enrichment sessions. Bella's behavior shifted dramatically as Kate began arranging the food items near the enclosure's central feeding area. The bear's hyperphagia-driven instincts interpreted Kate's presence near the food as direct competition for critical caloric resources, triggering an aggressive response that had never manifested during previous interactions. Bella's casual approach transformed into a determined advance as she moved to claim the food items that her survival instincts demanded did she protect? Kate recognized the change in Bella's demeanor and began moving toward the enclosure exit, but her retreat was hampered by the wet autumn leaves that had accumulated near the gate area. Her feet slipped on the slick surface as she attempted to quicken her pace, causing her to fall heavily just 15 feet from the safety of the exit. Bella's food defensive instincts activated fully when Kate's fall positioned her directly between the bear and the scattered food items. The bear's attack was swift and devastating as 300 pounds of muscle and bone struck Kate's prone form with tremendous force. Bella's powerful paws delivered crushing blows to Kate's chest and abdomen, her razor-sharp claws opening deep gashes while the impact fractured multiple ribs and damaged internal organs. The bear's massive jaws bit repeatedly at Kate's face and shoulders, her powerful teeth tearing through flesh and muscle as her food defensive response overwhelmed any recognition of the familiar human. Kate's body convulsed under the tremendous pressure as Bella's instinctive food protection response drove her to continue the mauling attack. The bear's claws raked across Kate's arms and torso as she bit down on Kate's shoulder and upper arm, her survival programming creating an overwhelming defensive reaction that had nothing to do with 3 years of positive human interaction. Kate's movements gradually weakened as blood loss and internal injuries overwhelmed her system, her body going limp as Bella's reactive aggression began to subside. The bear's attack ceased as Kate stopped moving, Bella's food defensive instincts no longer triggered by perceived competition. The massive animal retreated to the scattered enrichment items, her hyperphagia-driven focus returning to the critical caloric resources that had sparked the fatal encounter. Kate's groundskeeper discovered the scene 30 minutes later during his evening security rounds, immediately calling emergency services and wildlife authorities. The investigation revealed that Kate had violated her facility's own safety protocols by entering the enclosure alone during the critical hyperphagia period. Bella was eventually euthanized after the fatal encounter. The incident prompted immediate reviews of private wildlife facilities across Tennessee, with new regulations requiring enhanced safety training and mandatory seasonal restrictions on human-animal interactions. Kate's family established a scholarship fund for wildlife biology students, ensuring that her passion for conservation would continue supporting properly trained professionals. Her death highlighted the critical importance of understanding seasonal animal behaviors, even among species that appear docile during other times of the year. The early hours of June 18, 2018 brought the fog that Northern California surfers know well. Thick, low, rolling in off the Pacific before dawn, and sitting on the water until mid-morning, muffling sound, flattening the light, turning the ocean's surface into something gray and featureless. The water was cold. The visibility beneath the surface was poor. In those conditions before sunrise, that stretch of coastline felt like the edge of the world. For most surfers, that was reason enough to wait. Kyle Morrison had been awake since 4 a.m. Kyle was 24, a surfer from Santa Cruz who had spent the last 2 years chasing professional recognition with the kind of single-minded focus that people either admire or worry about, depending on how well they know you. He was talented, genuinely, visibly talented. But talent in surfing without sponsorship is just a hobby with better stories. And Kyle wanted more than stories. He wanted the kind of wave that didn't exist at the crowded breaks where everyone was already watching everyone else. He had a truck, a quiver of boards, and the ability to read a swell forecast well enough to find waves that most surfers didn't know existed or didn't bother to chase. His friends admired the commitment. A few of them worried about the alone part. Kyle didn't. He had identified the break weeks earlier, a remote point along a stretch of coastline that produced powerful, consistent waves and saw almost no foot traffic. It also sat adjacent to a rocky offshore area that served as a seal colony. He knew this. Seal colonies mean great whites, and great whites along the Northern California coast are not a rumor or a rarity. They are a documented, well-studied presence, particularly in the early morning hours when low light makes surface hunting conditions optimal. Kyle knew the biology. He had read about it. He paddled out anyway, alone, before sunrise, on a morning when the fog was thick and the underwater visibility was poor. Below him, a subadult great white, around 3.5 meters, not yet fully grown but already operating with the full predatory capability of its species, was working the area. Subadult great whites are in some ways more unpredictable than mature animals in these encounters. They are still calibrating, still learning to discriminate between prey, and they make contact more readily than older sharks that have developed more precise hunting instincts. Kyle lay on his board in the pre-dawn dark, paddling into position, his silhouette against the faint light of the surface looking from below, exactly like what the shark was hunting. The strike came upward, fast and total, the classic great white ambush from depth, the kind of attack that gives no warning because the warning would defeat the purpose. The force of the impact hit both the board and his lower body simultaneously, knocking him into the water. The shark released and moved off into the dark water below. Kyle surfaced. There was a stillness then, the kind that follows something too large to immediately understand. The water around him was changing. He was alone, in the dark, a long way from shore, and the injuries from that single strike had already decided the outcome. Great whites in California are well documented to disengage after an initial bite. The attack on Kyle was no exception. The shark did not return. The damage from one contact with an animal of that size, at that speed, from that angle, was catastrophic and complete. Kyle Morrison lost the ability to stay afloat. He died in the water before any assistance could reach him. His board washed ashore later that morning, the bite marks along the rail used by marine biologists to estimate the shark's size. Kyle's truck was found parked at the trailhead above the break, his phone inside. His body was recovered from the water that afternoon by the Coast Guard. It was September 9th, 2018. And the late morning crowds were already thick at a large metropolitan zoo in the United States, where the air smelled of popcorn and cut grass, and the distant calls of exotic birds carried across the open pathways. Families moved between exhibits in the warm September sun, the atmosphere relaxed and unhurried. The chimpanzee enclosure was a substantial habitat designed to replicate dense vegetation and rocky terrain of Central Africa, with a barrier system that included a wide outer railing and a significant drop into a moat-like enclosure below. Signage was posted clearly along the perimeter. The barrier was not subtle. It was not easy to misread. Corby Smith was 19 years old, and he had arrived that morning with a group of friends with a specific goal in mind. He was not there for the animals. He was there for content. He had spent months building a social media presence around stunts and boundary-pushing behavior, identifying the enclosure as the backdrop for attention online. He had made multiple attempts to climb the outer barrier earlier that morning, drawing warnings from visitors and at least one zoo staff member who had instructed him directly to step down. His friends kept their phones raised, treating each warning as part of the entertainment. Corby said more than once that the footage was going to blow up. He focused on the camera angle, not what was on the other side. Zoo staff member issued another direct warning as Corby climbed again. He laughed it off and pulled himself onto the inner ledge, balancing above the drop. He adjusted his position, phone raised, leaning for a better angle. He almost lost his footing once and caught himself. Rather than stepping back, he leaned further. His footing failed. Common chimpanzees are highly intelligent, social primates capable of extreme aggression during territorial or perceived threat situations. Adult males can exceed 100 pounds, but possess strength disproportionate to their size, with powerful jaws and a tendency to bite and tear soft tissue. Attacks escalate quickly into sustained mauling. Corby dropped into the enclosure and hit the ground hard. The nearest adult male chimpanzee reacted instantly, vocalizing sharply as others turned, then charged. He closed the distance in seconds before launching onto Corby. The chimpanzee grabbed his arm and shoulder, biting down and pulling while using its limbs to control him. Corby screamed as he was dragged across the rocky floor. His head struck the ground hard on the first impact. Without releasing, it repositioned its bite, tearing while maintaining grip, pulling him in short, forceful bursts rather than a directed drag. A second chimpanzee approached, striking and grabbing in quick, erratic bursts before circling back. The first chimp drove Corby down again, continuing to bite and pull. There was no pause, only sustained mauling, biting, shaking, and jerking movements in rapid succession. His body twisted under the force, his head striking rock repeatedly at irregular angles. The chimp continued pulling and repositioning him across the enclosure floor, movements disrupted by shouting from above. The outcome was driven by speed and relentless aggression. Not a single blow. Severe trauma accumulated, deep lacerations, crushing bites, and repeated blunt force impacts to the head. Corby did not get back up or regain. Coordinated movement. The cumulative trauma left him unresponsive. The chimpanzee remained briefly nearby, agitated and vocalizing, before retreating as noise increased. Corby did not move as staff began to intervene. Death was later attributed to severe traumatic brain injury, combined with extensive blood loss and shock from sustained mauling and repeated impact with the enclosure surface. Zoo staff initiated emergency protocols immediately, moving the chimpanzees to a holding area. Emergency services entered and reached Corby, but he was unresponsive. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Local authorities conducted a formal investigation, reviewing footage that captured the sequence, including prior warnings. The chimpanzees were not destroyed, with officials determining the animals had responded to a direct intrusion consistent with natural behavior. The zoo announced a review of barrier heights and visitor monitoring. His friends who had filmed the incident were questioned. Public reaction was intense and divided, with grief for a teenager's death alongside anger at the circumstances. It was August 14, 2017, and the late summer landscape of Alaska's interior mountains had reached its final weeks before the first serious snowfall would drive remaining hikers out of the high country. For the Tenbrook family, the annual backpacking expedition represented a cherished tradition spanning over 15 years of wilderness exploration. Wyatt Tenbrook, 52, had built a successful construction business in Anchorage, but his passion remained the wild country where grizzlies ruled the salmon streams and human presence was temporary at best. His wife, Shailene, 50, shared his enthusiasm for extended wilderness travel, having accompanied him on expeditions throughout Alaska and Western Canada. Their adult son, accompanying them on this trip, had logged hundreds of miles in the backcountry and considered himself competent in bear country protocols. The family carried bear-resistant food containers, had completed multiple wilderness safety courses, and typically exercised caution when selecting camp locations. The chosen campsite, however, represented a critical error in judgment. The family established their tents in a meadow approximately 100 yards from a major salmon stream, selecting the location based on scenic value and apparent isolation rather than wildlife corridor analysis. August marked the peak of hyperphagia, the period when grizzly bears desperately consume massive quantities of food to prepare for winter hibernation. During this window, bears may feed for most of the day, their behavior driven by biological imperatives that override normal caution around humans. Previous hikers in the area had reported a bold bear that approached camps without typical wariness, behavior that suggested either habituation to human food sources or a predatory individual that had lost fear of humans entirely. The Tenbrook family had received no specific warning about this animal, though general bear activity alerts had been posted at the trailhead where they began their expedition 3 days earlier. Grizzly bears are North America's most powerful terrestrial predators, with adult males in Alaska's interior commonly exceeding 800 pounds and standing 7 feet tall when upright. Despite their massive bulk, grizzlies can sprint at speeds approaching 35 miles per hour over short distances, faster than any human can react. Most grizzly attacks are defensive, triggered when bears are surprised at close range or protecting cubs. However, rare predatory attacks do occur, typically involving food-conditioned or habituated bears that have learned to associate humans with accessible calories. Predatory bear attacks differ fundamentally from defensive encounters. Bears attacking defensively typically strike, assess whether the threat has been neutralized, and disengage. Predatory bears approach silently, target the head and neck with initial bites, and begin feeding once prey is incapacitated. Forensic evidence of predatory behavior includes consumption patterns focused on high-calorie areas, such as thighs and abdomen, with minimal defensive swipe wounds, indicating the victim had little opportunity to fight back. The attack occurred at approximately 11:30 p.m. The family had retired to their tents 3 hours earlier, food stored in bear-resistant containers positioned 50 yards from the sleeping area. Investigators would later note that the containers showed no signs of tampering, and no food attractants were found at the campsite itself, suggesting no evidence that food conditioning directly triggered the attack. The adult son would later report hearing fabric tearing, followed immediately by his father's screams. Before he could exit his own tent, the screaming had stopped. Wyatt had been attacked inside his tent by a large male grizzly that had approached with complete silence. Forensic evidence later confirmed that the initial bite targeted his head and neck, delivering massive trauma that would have caused rapid loss of consciousness. Shailene exited her tent and attempted intervention, but the bear shifted its focus to her immediately. The adult son, recognizing predatory behavior from the bear's unwillingness to disengage, fled into the darkness rather than attempting a rescue that would have resulted in his own death. He ran for over 2 miles before stopping, remaining concealed in dense vegetation until first light. The journey to the nearest ranger station required an additional 12 hours of hiking, with the survivor reaching help at approximately 3 p.m. the following afternoon. The recovery team, accompanied by armed wildlife officers, reached the site 36 hours after the attack. The remote location and absence of human activity in the intervening period had allowed the grizzly to remain near the site undisturbed. The bear was found within 100 yards of the campsite, remaining near the site and returning intermittently to feed. Officers destroyed the animal before approaching the scene. Both victims had suffered catastrophic trauma, with forensic evidence confirming that the bear had fed intermittently through the night. The bite pattern and consumption areas were consistent with predatory attack behavior. Minimal evidence of prolonged defensive struggle was present on either victim, indicating the speed and ferocity of the initial assault had prevented meaningful resistance. Investigation concluded the attack was predatory in nature. The bear displayed unusually low fear of humans, though evidence of direct food conditioning was inconclusive. The camp's location within an active salmon corridor, combined with peak hyperphagia timing, had placed the family in extreme danger. Investigators noted that even experienced backcountry travelers could make fatal errors when evaluating seemingly peaceful wilderness locations. It was July 22, 2015 in Miami, where a week of heavy summer, rain had pushed water levels across the city's extensive canal network well above their normal seasonal lines. The storms had come in off the Atlantic in the way South Florida storms do, fast, heavy, and relentless, dropping large amounts of water in short periods and overwhelming drainage systems already operating near capacity. By the time the rain eased, the canals running behind residential neighborhoods had risen noticeably, their banks narrowed and in some places submerged, blurring the line between water and land. The neighborhoods built along Miami's residential canals occupy a particular geography, one where the boundary between human space and aquatic habitat is defined by a few feet of grass and a concrete edge rather than any meaningful barrier. The canals were engineered features, carved through what had been wetland and marsh, and the wildlife that had inhabited those wetlands had not disappeared when development arrived. American crocodiles had been a documented presence in canal systems connected to the coastal waterways of southern Miami, particularly where brackish conditions extended inland, and long-term residents had developed a working familiarity with the animals, knowing not to approach the water at night, knowing to keep pets away from the canal edge, knowing that the dark water held things not always visible from the bank. Marcus Reed was 28 years old and had grown up in Florida. His relationship with the state's wildlife was shaped by familiarity rather than fear. He had been around crocodiles his entire life, aware of them, respectful in a general sense, but not actively cautious in the way that someone encountering them for the first time might be. The canal behind his neighborhood was simply part of the landscape, a feature he had lived alongside without incident for long enough that it had stopped registering as a source of risk. What the heavy rains had done, beyond raising water levels, was fundamentally alter the distribution of crocodiles throughout the connected waterway system. Crocodiles move through water with ease and follow channels wherever they lead, and the elevated water levels had opened access to residential canals that would normally have been too shallow or disconnected to attract large animals. The banks of those channels, lower than usual, partially submerged, brought a crocodile's effective hunting range directly to the edge of people's backyards. Crocodiles are ambush predators in the most complete sense. Their hunting strategy is built entirely around patience and concealment, lying motionless near a shoreline with only eyes and nostrils breaking the surface, waiting for prey to approach close enough to make a strike viable. They do not chase. They wait for the moment when distance collapses to the point where an explosive lunge can close the gap before the prey has any realistic chance of reacting. Late that night, Marcus approached the canal bank to retrieve something he had dropped near the edge. When he got there, he crouched at the waterline. The act of crouching brought him lower, closer to the water's surface, and the movement sent vibrations through the ground. The precise sensory inputs that a crocodile positioned near the bank had been waiting for. The animal had been there, motionless, for some time before Marcus arrived. It was a large male, positioned close to the bank, in the way crocodiles do when in hunting mode, patient, invisible, and ready. The elevated water level had brought it within striking range of the bank without requiring it to move onto dry ground at all. The lunge came without warning, as crocodile strikes always do. The animal exploded from the water and clamped onto his shoulder and upper arm, immediately pulling backward into the canal with the full power of its tail and hindquarters. Once Marcus was in the water, the crocodile performed a death roll, a rapid, full-body rotation that disorients, causes catastrophic tearing of soft tissue at the point of the bite, and uses the animal's body weight and rotational momentum to subdue resistance. The death roll is not a learned behavior or a tactical choice. It is a fixed action pattern, triggered automatically once the animal has secured a grip on prey in the water. Marcus drowned within minutes. The canal, a familiar and unremarkable feature of his neighborhood, had become the environment in which an apex predator held every possible advantage. It was August 9th, 2014. By mid-afternoon, heat settled over a gated 12-acre estate outside Ocala, where a private animal compound stood behind the main house. Inside one enclosure, a filtered plunge pool sat beneath live oaks, and a narrow service corridor connected a double-gate entry system built to meet Florida Class 1 wildlife standards. Calla Merritt, 38, was a board-certified veterinary surgeon who owned 2 specialty animal hospitals in Central Florida. Her husband, Owen Speck, 42, managed real estate investments after selling his landscaping company. The property served as both residence and private collection. Among antelope and exotic birds, they kept a female pygmy hippopotamus named Lulu, acquired the previous year through a licensed broker after a small zoological facility closed. Transfer paperwork existed, but later review noted gaps in inspection timing and access controls. The enclosure met structural requirements: 8-foot welded steel panel fencing, reinforced posts set in concrete, and a double-gate entry with a keyed deadbolt backing up a slide latch. State rules required the secondary lock be engaged during access. Pygmy hippopotamuses are smaller than common hippos, but remain powerful megafauna. Adult females typically weigh 400 to 600 pounds. They are territorial around water and feeding areas. In confined spaces, they respond to close movement with short, direct charges. Their jaws can fracture a pelvis or femur. Rather than slashing, they rely on forward mass, clamping force, and sustained pressure. That afternoon, Calla hosted a small gathering for colleagues and neighbors. Owen was at the front acreage reviewing drainage work. Guests stood within sight of the enclosure fencing. Earlier, Calla had placed feed inside the pen near the shaded corner opposite the pool. As questions arose about Lulu's care, she decided to reposition the feed buckets away from patio view. She entered through the service gate, closing it behind her. The slide latch engaged. The keyed deadbolt was not turned. She carried a 5-gallon feed bucket across the concrete. Lulu stood partially submerged in the plunge pool, head angled toward Calla's movement. Witnesses said the animal appeared calm. Calla set one bucket down and moved a second closer to the fence line. When she turned to rinse her hands near the pool edge, the distance between her and Lulu narrowed to under 10 feet. Lulu exited the water without sound. Guests heard a heavy impact on concrete. Lulu closed the gap in a short burst and struck Calla at hip level. The force drove her sideways. As she tried to pivot toward the gate, Lulu clamped across her pelvis and upper thigh, forcing her flat. There was no chase. The behavior was direct. Clamp, drive forward, maintain pressure. Guests shouted but did not enter. One called 911. Another struck the outer panels with a shovel. Lulu released briefly, repositioned, and delivered a second clamp lower across the pelvic girdle. The force twisted Calla's torso against the concrete. Witnesses described sustained downward pressure rather than shaking. Lulu pressed forward with head and chest weight, pinning her near the pool edge. Blood spread beneath her within seconds. The sequence lasted under a minute. Emergency services were notified within seconds of the impact. Responders were advised of a large captive animal attack. Arrival from the nearest rural station required several minutes. Guests sprayed water through the mesh and tossed feed from a protected angle. Lulu shifted toward the pool, creating a brief opening. Calla stopped moving before deputies arrived. Law enforcement secured the perimeter and followed large animal protocol. Using feed placement and distance barriers, they guided Lulu away from the service gate. Once clear, responders entered and extracted Calla. She had no pulse and was not breathing. CPR was initiated during transport to a regional trauma center. She was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The medical examiner listed the cause of death as massive internal hemorrhage due to crushing bite trauma to the pelvis and lower abdomen. Injuries included multiple pelvic fractures, a shattered left femur, disruption of major pelvic vessels, and extensive soft tissue destruction consistent with high-force compression from a large herbivorous mammal. The injuries were rapidly fatal. Florida wildlife authorities seized Lulu within 48 hours. A full inspection followed. Investigators cited failure to engage the secondary lock during active access and inadequate separation between feeding routines and social gatherings. Because the animal had been legally transferred, penalties were administrative. Within months, the estate was sold and the enclosure dismantled. The double gate system and latch mechanisms were documented in the investigative file. The final report emphasized that pygmy hippopotamuses remain Class 1 wildlife with defensive feeding behaviors incompatible with residential settings. The fencing did not fail. The steel panels held. The breakdown occurred during routine feed adjustment inside a confined space where a territorial 500-pound animal needed only one sustained clamp to cause fatal hemorrhage. It was June 11, 2014, and the heat in Orlando had already climbed past 95 degrees by noon, turning the concrete paddocks of a circus facility into baking slabs that radiated visible waves of distortion. The chain-link perimeter sagged in places, patched with wire and improvised repairs, while the tigers paced restlessly in their cramped enclosures. Steve Carmichael was a 37-year-old animal handler who had spent 15 years working the circus circuit before transitioning to private animal shows and roadside attractions. His colleagues knew him as someone who treated big cats with a mixture of contempt and bravado. They said that Steve believed that dominance and intimidation were the keys to animal control, a philosophy that had earned him both admirers among thrill-seeking facility owners and critics from experienced handlers who recognized the danger in his methods. He carried a steel prod stick everywhere, using it liberally to poke, jab, and assert control over the animals in his care, and had a habit of insisting on working alone during transfers despite objections from staff. That afternoon, Steve had been hired by the facility owner to help prepare a 7-year-old 450-pound Siberian tiger named Khan for a private photo demonstration with staff members. Khan had been purchased from a bankrupt circus just 6 months earlier, with incomplete transfer paperwork and no documented post-transfer behavioral assessment, and had a documented history of aggressive behavior. Steve's reputation for handling difficult animals had preceded him, and the owner believed he could force Khan into cooperation where others had failed. Steve had arrived that morning with his steel stick. Siberian tigers are among the largest cats on Earth, with males weighing between 400 and 700 pounds and measuring up to 11 feet from nose to tail. Their canine teeth can reach 3 inches in length, designed to pierce through hide and sever spinal cords. A tiger's bite force is capable of crushing bones with ease. Most critically, tigers under stress in confined spaces exhibit heightened aggression, and their attacks are characterized by explosive speed and devastating efficiency during short, high-intensity bursts. They strike at the neck and throat instinctively, a killing technique refined over millions of years. The trouble began when Steve attempted to force Khan into a transport cage barely large enough for the tiger to turn around. 3 facility workers were present, and at least 2 verbally expressed concern that the cage was too small and that Khan had been pacing and vocalizing all morning. Classic signs of stress. Steve dismissed their warnings with obscenities, telling them they didn't understand how to handle dangerous animals. He approached the cage entry with his steel stick, tapping Khan repeatedly on the haunches and head, trying to drive the tiger backward into the cramped space without coordinated team support. Khan's body language deteriorated rapidly. His ears flattened against his skull, his tail began thumping against the concrete floor, and a low rumbling growl emerged from his chest. The tiger circled the small space repeatedly, unable to distance himself from Steve's prodding. His pupils dilated, and his breathing became heavy and audible. One worker later reported that Khan had turned to face Steve directly and held his gaze, a threatening behavior that should have prompted immediate retreat. Instead, Steve leaned over the cage entry, jabbing the stick toward Khan's face and shoulders, attempting to intimidate him into submission. Moments later, Khan lunged forward with a burst of speed that covered the 6 feet between them in less than a second. His jaws clamped directly onto Steve's neck, the 3-inch canines puncturing through skin, muscle, and causing massive arterial damage. Steve's scream was cut short as the pressure crushed his windpipe. The force of the impact threw him backward, but Khan maintained his grip, dragging Steve's body across the concrete floor toward the center of the enclosure. The workers began shouting, frozen in momentary panic, before one grabbed a nearby steel pole and began jabbing at Khan through the fence. The tiger remained focused on Steve. His front claws, each up to 4 inches long, ripped into Steve's torso, tearing through his shirt and opening deep gashes across his chest and abdomen. Khan released Steve's neck only to reposition, clamping his jaws around Steve's left shoulder. The tiger began shaking Steve violently from side to side, a behavior tigers use to break the necks of large prey. Steve's body jerked like a rag doll, his arms flopping limply. The workers threw chairs and tools at the tiger, shouting desperately, but Khan continued his assault. He dragged Steve to the far corner of the enclosure, jaws now clamped around the upper torso, crushing ribs and puncturing lungs. Steve had stopped moving entirely, his body limp and broken. Only when one worker threw a metal folding chair that struck Khan directly in the head did the tiger finally release his grip and retreat to the opposite side of the enclosure, momentarily startled by the impact. One worker ran approximately 200 yards to a neighboring property and screamed for them to call 911, as the facility lacked functional radios and had unreliable cell reception in the handling area. Emergency responders arrived 8 minutes later, but Steve Carmichael was already dead. Paramedics noted that he had lost consciousness within the first minute of the attack due to massive blood loss from the neck injury. The medical examiner's report listed cause of death as exsanguination and traumatic asphyxiation due to animal attack. The facility was immediately shut down by the wildlife authorities, and criminal charges were filed against the owner for multiple safety violations and improper containment of dangerous animals. Khan was later immobilized by a trained capture team and wildlife veterinarian using remote sedation equipment and transferred to a secure wildlife sanctuary in North Carolina. The incident prompted renewed scrutiny of Florida's exotic animal industry and led to stricter enforcement of existing regulations. It was May 3rd, 2017, at an unlicensed roadside exotic animal compound outside Las Vegas, Nevada. The facility sat on several acres of desert scrubland, surrounded by chain-link fencing and scattered with makeshift enclosures. The compound operated in a legal gray area, offering paid photo opportunities with exotic animals without proper oversight. Dust swirled across the property in the afternoon heat, and the smell of animal waste hung in the air. Zebi, 29, was a viral wildlife challenge creator. His videos featured him getting as close as possible to dangerous animals in risky situations. He had contacted the compound's caretaker weeks earlier, negotiating payment for exclusive close-range footage. The caretaker mentioned that the African lion had recently been relocated from another facility, and that feeding time was approaching. Zebi arrived with his body camera recording, stating clearly that he wanted unscripted predator footage from as close as possible, ideally from a service corridor attached to the enclosure itself. The caretaker expressed hesitation, but ultimately agreed after Zebi increased his payment offer. The enclosure housed a single male African lion, approximately 8 years old. The animal paced near the far wall as Zebi set up his equipment. The caretaker led him to a narrow service corridor that ran along the enclosure's side, separated from the lion's space by a sliding metal gate. The corridor was barely 6 meters long, used for feeding and maintenance. Zebi convinced the caretaker to let him film from inside this corridor, insisting he needed only a few minutes for a walking monologue with the lion visible in the background. Once there, Zebi pushed for more dramatic footage. He persuaded the caretaker to partially open the inner sliding gate, creating a narrow gap between the corridor and the main enclosure. The caretaker warned him to stay back, but agreed to prop the gate open slightly, while remaining nearby with a control pole. African lions are apex predators native to sub-Saharan Africa, with males weighing between 350 to 500 pounds. They possess immense strength and can reach speeds up to 50 miles per hour over short distances. Lions have retractable claws up to 1.5 inches long, and canine teeth exceeding 3 inches in length. Their bite force approaches 650 pounds per square inch, sufficient to crush bone and sever spinal cords. Male lions are particularly territorial and can become aggressive when their space is invaded, especially during periods of stress or hunger. Zebi's body camera filmed as he moved along the corridor toward the partially opened gate, speaking about the thrill of being separated from an apex predator by only a few feet. The lion watched him intently, its ears forward and body lowered slightly. Zebi continued his monologue, describing the power and majesty of the creature before him. He stepped closer to the gap, reaching out momentarily to gesture toward the animal. The lion rose and began approaching. Zebi paused but continued filming, likely believing the barrier would hold. What Zebi failed to notice was the lion's shifting posture. The animal's tail had gone rigid, its shoulders hunched low, weight shifting to its hindquarters. Its eyes had locked onto him with predatory fixation. The muscles along its flanks rippled with tension. Every instinct honed over millions of years of evolution had identified Zebi not as an observer, but as prey entering striking range. The lion was hunting. The lion suddenly lunged through the partially opened gate. The improperly latched sliding gate shifted under the force, the metal barrier widening as the animal pushed through with its shoulder. The lion charged, closing the distance in the narrow corridor within seconds. The confined space left Zebi no room to retreat. The lion struck him with both forelimbs, the impact knocking him face first into the concrete floor. The collision fractured his collarbone and dislocated his shoulder. The lion's weight, over 400 pounds, pinned his torso completely. Before Zebi could move, the lion clamped its jaws around the side of his neck. The bite severed both carotid arteries and punctured the jugular vein. Blood sprayed from the wounds in pulsing jets. Zebi's arms thrashed violently as his body registered the attack, hands clawing at the concrete floor. The lion's claws dug deeper into his shoulders and back, tearing through muscle tissue. The severed carotid arteries caused his brain to be starved of oxygenated blood almost immediately. His movements became uncoordinated within 10 seconds as consciousness began to slip away. Blood pooled rapidly beneath his body. After 15 seconds, his resistance weakened dramatically. By 20 seconds, his arms fell limp. The lion held the bite for several minutes, long after all movement had ceased. Zebi died from catastrophic blood loss and oxygen deprivation to the brain. The caretaker shouted and beat the metal fencing with his control pole, attempting to distract the lion, but the animal ignored him completely. Even after the body had gone still, the lion maintained its grip. The caretaker called for emergency services and the compound owner, who arrived with a tranquilizer team. Only after the lion was chemically sedated did it finally release its grip. The animal staggered back into the main enclosure, where it collapsed minutes later. The body camera had captured the charge and initial impact before the lens pointed toward the concrete, recording only muffled audio and darkness. Emergency services arrived within 30 minutes, but Zebi was pronounced dead at the scene. The compound was immediately shut down by local authorities, and the lion was placed under quarantine pending investigation, later transferred to a licensed sanctuary. An investigation revealed multiple violations of animal welfare and public safety regulations. The facility owner faced criminal charges for operating without proper permits and allowing unauthorized access to dangerous animals. It was August 23, 2018. Late afternoon light stretched across the national park, warming dry grass and exposed rock. Wind moved steadily along the ridge, carrying scent through open terrain where visibility was clear, but distance and elevation masked how quickly something could close the gap. Denise hadn't come out there just to hike. The trip came right after her divorce, and she had been telling people she was finally doing things on her own now. The trail wasn't random. She picked it because it was popular, photogenic, and something she could post about. She wanted proof that she could handle it, that she didn't need help, and that she wasn't going to sit around playing it safe. The photos mattered more than the hike itself. She had already been stopping often, redoing shots, checking angles, and making sure everything looked right. When she saw the cub, it wasn't just an animal. It was the kind of moment she had been hoping for. Something close, something different, something that would stand out compared to everyone else's distant wildlife pictures. The trail cut through active grizzly territory, and it was late summer, peak feeding season. Berry patches covered sections of the slope, and bears were moving through the area for hours at a time, building fat reserves. A female with a cub operated differently. Her focus wasn't just feeding, it was protection. Grizzly mothers keep their cubs close and react quickly to anything that approaches too directly. They may bluff charge at longer distances, but when space closes and the threat continues forward, the response becomes immediate and physical. Once the mother commits, the movement is direct and forceful. It's fast, low, and controlled, covering ground in seconds over uneven terrain. The goal isn't to hunt, it's to stop the threat. The first contact typically comes as a full-body impact, using weight and momentum to knock the target down. From there, the attack shifts into force, swipes with the forelimbs to disable, followed by bites aimed at the head, neck, or upper body. The pressure is applied until movement stops. About 80 yards ahead, movement caught the attention of several hikers. A small bear cub stepped out from the brush along the slope below. Those who recognized the situation reacted right away, backing up, while urging others to do the same. Voices grew more direct as they pointed out the obvious. If there was a cub, the mother was close. Denise didn't follow. Instead of stepping back with the group, she moved off the trail, angling downhill for a better view. When someone called out again, telling her to move away, she responded over her shoulder without stopping. She raised her phone, adjusting her position as the cub shifted in and out of the brush. Behind her, the distance between the hikers and the slope widened. She kept moving forward, step by step, closing the distance without fully realizing it. By the time she stopped, she was well inside the space the bear would defend. The cub looked small from where she stood, and nothing about it matched the urgency in the voices behind her. The cub noticed her and made small distress sounds, and that was enough. The mother bear, partially hidden behind brush and rocks higher on the slope, lifted her head and fixed on Denise. Her posture changed immediately, head low, body forward. Other hikers saw it and started shouting for Denise to move back, but she hesitated. In the same time, the bear charged. It moved fast across uneven ground, covering the remaining distance in seconds. Denise only reacted when the shouting turned urgent, but by then, the gap had already collapsed. The bear slammed into her, knocking her backward onto the rocky ground. The impact alone forced the air out of her lungs. The bear followed immediately with powerful swipes to her upper body. Its claws caused deep, tearing injuries, while the force broke ribs and destabilized her chest. Denise tried to raise her arms, but it made no difference. The bear then bit down across her head and shoulder, its jaws applying crushing pressure. The bite caused severe trauma to the skull and neck, while tearing the scalp and damaging underlying structures. The attack lasted about 20 to 30 seconds in short, forceful bursts. Once Denise stopped moving, the bear released and stepped back, watching briefly before turning uphill toward its cub. The hikers stayed back to avoid another charge. After several minutes, they moved in and called for help using a satellite device. Rescue teams arrived later by air, but Denise was declared dead at the scene. Her injuries matched a defensive grizzly attack, including severe trauma to the chest, ribs, skull, and neck, along with heavy blood loss. The investigation confirmed a defensive encounter. Denise had moved too close to a cub despite repeated warnings, triggering the bear's response at close range. The trail was temporarily closed during the review and later reopened with stronger safety warnings, posted alerts, and increased ranger monitoring of bear activity. It was March 14, 2017, and the humid evening air hung heavy over the cypress-lined waterways surrounding Vincent Broussard's exotic animal breeding facility near Lake Charles, Louisiana. The 41-year-old former investment banker had returned to his native Louisiana after making millions on Wall Street, using his fortune to establish what he claimed was a legitimate commercial operation, breeding American alligators for leather and meat production. The facility sprawled across 20 acres of reclaimed swampland, featuring concrete enclosures and climate-controlled buildings designed to house some of the largest reptiles in North America. Vincent had grown up in the Louisiana bayous, where encounters with alligators were simply part of daily life for anyone who spent time around the water. His childhood experiences hunting and fishing in gator-infested waters had given him a confidence around large reptiles that impressed the state wildlife officials who inspected his facility. Vincent employed one part-time handler, but preferred to work alone during evening feeding routines, believing his intimate knowledge of alligator behavior made additional supervision unnecessary. The facility's prize breeding male was a 12-foot monster named Big Jake, whose impressive size and aggressive temperament made him valuable for producing offspring with desirable commercial traits. Vincent had acquired Jake from a failed roadside attraction in Florida, and the massive reptile had adapted well to his new Louisiana home. However, the cooler March temperatures had made Jake increasingly lethargic, and his refusal to feed for several days had begun to concern Vincent about the animal's health and breeding potential. What Vincent hadn't mentioned to his insurance company was his habit of testing the alligator's responsiveness by tapping the water surface with feeding poles during off hours. He had developed this routine after reading outdated wildlife management texts from the 1980s, believing that regular stimulation would keep the reptiles alert and healthy. His part-time handler had never witnessed these sessions, as Vincent conducted them exclusively during evening hours when he worked alone. The practice had become almost compulsive, with Vincent spending increasingly longer periods trying to provoke responses from animals that showed signs of seasonal lethargy. American alligators are apex predators that can reach lengths of 14 feet and weights exceeding 1,000 pounds, with adult males being particularly territorial and aggressive during breeding season. These ancient reptiles possess incredible patience and explosive power, capable of remaining motionless for hours before launching devastating attacks that can crush bones and tear limbs from bodies. Their bite force can exceed 3,000 pounds per square inch, while their death roll technique is designed to disorient prey and cause massive trauma through rapid spinning motions. Vincent's concern about Big Jake's feeding behavior led him to make an unscheduled evening visit to the alligator's concrete enclosure, hoping to encourage the massive reptile to resume normal eating patterns. The 12-foot male had been floating motionlessly in the center of his pool for most of the day, showing none of the aggressive feeding responses that typically characterized his behavior. Vincent believed that personal attention and hand feeding might stimulate Jake's appetite and resolve what he assumed was a temporary health issue. The fatal mistake occurred when Vincent approached too close to the water's edge while attempting to encourage Big Jake to feed using a long-handled feeding pole. The concrete surrounding the enclosure had become slick with evening condensation, and Vincent's focus on the apparently lethargic alligator caused him to underestimate the treacherous footing. His confidence in Jake's sluggish condition led him to position himself within striking distance of the water, believing the cold-stunned reptile posed no immediate threat. Big Jake's explosive attack shattered the evening silence as 650 pounds of muscle and bone erupted from the water with shocking speed. The massive alligator's jaws snapped shut on Vincent's leg with bone-crushing force, his razor-sharp teeth puncturing deep into flesh and muscle, while his powerful bite caused severe tissue damage and potential fractures. Vincent's scream of pain and terror echoed across the facility as Jake's prehistoric instincts took control of the situation. The alligator's death roll began immediately as Jake used his massive body weight and powerful tail to spin Vincent in the water, the rapid rotation causing devastating trauma to the trapped leg while disorienting the banker and preventing any coordinated escape attempts. Vincent's desperate struggles to reach the concrete edge only triggered Jake's feeding response further, the alligator's grip tightening as his prey's movements confirmed the success of his ambush attack. Vincent's body was pulled completely into the enclosure as Jake's death roll continued, the massive reptile's spinning motion causing massive soft tissue destruction and blood loss, while preventing Vincent from maintaining his position above water. The alligator's powerful jaws maintained their crushing grip as Vincent's struggles gradually weakened, his body going limp as severe trauma and drowning combined to end his desperate fight for survival. Jake continued his death roll for several more minutes before releasing his grip and retreating to the deeper section of his enclosure. Vincent's part-time employee discovered the scene the following morning when he arrived for routine feeding duties, immediately calling emergency services and wildlife authorities to report the incident. The investigation revealed that Vincent had approached the enclosure alone during evening hours, violating his own facility's safety protocols that required two-person teams for all alligator interactions. Big Jake was eventually destroyed while the breeding operation was permanently closed, pending investigation. The incident prompted immediate reviews of commercial alligator operations across Louisiana, with new regulations requiring enhanced safety equipment and mandatory buddy systems for all animal interactions. Vincent's investment firm established a conservation fund supporting legitimate wildlife research, ensuring that his passion for his native Louisiana's ecosystem would continue benefiting scientific understanding. His death served as a sobering reminder that childhood familiarity with dangerous animals cannot overcome the fundamental reality that wild predators remain wild, regardless of human confidence or commercial interests. It was the evening of October 14, 2016, on the quiet forested outskirts of Bozeman, Montana, where pine trees pressed close against scattered cabins, and the air carried the damp chill of early autumn. The sun had slipped behind the ridgeline, casting amber streaks across the deck of a modest single-story home just off a gravel road. The property bordered a stretch of woodland known as a seasonal wildlife corridor. That week, residents exchanged messages about a grizzly bear repeatedly raiding unsecured trash bins, growing bold and familiar with the scent of human food. Inside the cabin lived Sandy Scraw, a 34-year-old freelance graphic designer who had moved to Montana only months earlier in search of quiet, cheaper rent and scenery that fit her small vlog channel. With roughly 4,000 subscribers, she filmed soft, slow-paced videos about cabin routines and remote living. She had no background in wildlife and no understanding of how quickly the forest behind her home could turn hostile. Her outdoor trash containers were plastic, lidless, and often overflowing with meat scraps. Grease from her stovetop drifted through the kitchen vent on the evening breeze toward the tree line. That night, she had set up her camera on a small tripod near the counter, filming a casual cooking segment as dusk settled in. The grizzly bear is the largest and most powerful land predator in North America, capable of weighing over 800 pounds and reaching speeds of 35 miles per hour in short bursts. Food-conditioned grizzlies, those that associate human dwellings with easy calories, are among the most dangerous animals a person can encounter. When strongly motivated by food, they may push into human structures, and typical residential barriers can fail quickly under force. The first sign came as a low scraping sound along the exterior wall. The camera continued recording as a massive shape appeared behind the sliding glass door. The grizzly lowered its head, pressing its snout to the frame, inhaling deeply. Then it rose, placing its weight against the glass. The wooden frame groaned but held for a moment. Sandy turned, frozen between the stove and counter, directly in line with the door and the scent pulling the animal forward. Without hesitation, the bear dropped its weight forward in a violent lunge. The glass shattered inward as the frame tore loose. The grizzly forced its head and shoulders through the opening, widening the gap with sheer mass. Sandy stepped back but hesitated, still positioned between the animal and the kitchen where the meat aromas were strongest. Her fatal mistake was remaining in that direct line, rather than retreating into a sealed interior room the moment the bear made contact with the door. As the grizzly pushed fully inside, the confined space and sudden proximity triggered a rapid, chaotic defensive reaction. A powerful forelimb swung in a short arc, striking her shoulder and upper chest with devastating force, claws opening deep lacerations and fracturing her collarbone. She was knocked sideways into the cabinets and collapsed onto the tile floor. In the same burst of movement, the bear's head dipped and snapped forward in a brief bite, clamping and releasing almost instantly. There was no clear sequence, only overlapping motion, driven by momentum, stress, and confusion. It continued forward, its weight crashing across her ribs as it forced through the narrow space. The camera was struck and knocked sideways, capturing only a blur of fur as the grizzly pushed deeper into the kitchen. By the time neighbors heard the commotion and contacted authorities, the bear was gone, slipping back into the tree line. Wildlife officials arrived within the hour, securing the scene and launching an investigation. Within days, teams located and euthanized the grizzly, confirming it was the same animal responsible for the trash raids that week. The community responded with shock and sorrow, neighbors leaving flowers along the gravel road, and online followers flooding her final videos with messages of grief. It was October 14, 2018, when heavy autumn swells pushed turbid water along the north shore of Oahu, Hawaii. Recent storms had stirred sediment from the ocean floor, reducing underwater visibility to less than 10 feet along the outer reef. A confirmed tiger shark sighting earlier that morning had prompted lifeguards to post red warning flags and issue verbal advisories for all swimmers and surfers to exit the water. By mid-morning, most of the regular surf crowd had complied. Tamsin Calloway was a 31-year-old Australian fitness influencer from Sydney's northern beaches, visiting Hawaii on a 3-week content creation trip funded by a sportswear brand. Calloway had built a following of over 200,000 across her platforms through a mix of surf photography, ocean swimming footage, and fitness content filmed in exotic coastal locations. Her brand depended on dramatic ocean imagery, and the North Shore's famous winter swells represented a critical content opportunity. Calloway had arrived at the beach shortly after the advisory was posted. A lifeguard approached her in the parking area and informed her that the water was closed due to a shark sighting and that conditions were dangerous. Calloway told the lifeguard she was from Australia, had grown up surfing around sharks, and that the advisory was an overreaction. She pointed out that several surfers were still visible beyond the break and suggested the closure was not being enforced seriously. The lifeguard repeated the advisory firmly and explained that the remaining surfers had been in the water before the sighting and were being directed to shore. Calloway laughed and told him that Australian beaches stayed open in worse conditions than this. She dismissed him and walked toward the waterline with a borrowed surfboard. A second lifeguard on the tower used a megaphone to direct Calloway not to enter the water. She hesitated briefly at the waterline, scanning the murky surface, then paddled out regardless, moving past the shore break and toward the outer reef approximately 200 yards offshore. Tiger sharks are one of the species most frequently involved in serious shark incidents worldwide, and among the most common culprits in fatal encounters in Hawaiian waters. Adults commonly exceed 12 feet in length and can weigh over 1,400 pounds. Tiger sharks are opportunistic predators that patrol turbid nearshore waters, relying on reduced visibility to approach prey undetected. Their broad, serrated teeth are designed to shear through flesh, bone, and even sea turtle shell. Most attacks involve a single powerful strike from below or behind, though secondary bites have been documented when continued movement in the water draws the shark back. The shark was believed to have been in the area throughout the morning based on multiple sightings. Lifeguards had spotted what they believed to be the same animal twice in the previous 2 hours, estimating its length at over 12 feet. According to witness accounts from surfers who had remained in the water, Calloway had been paddling along the outer reef for approximately 15 minutes when the strike occurred. The shark struck from below, the impact severely, damaging the board and pulling Calloway into the water. Witnesses described a powerful initial strike, followed by a brief secondary bite before the water settled. The injuries were catastrophic. No prolonged feeding behavior was observed, consistent with an investigatory or predatory strike pattern. Lifeguards on jet skis reached the area within 4 minutes. They recovered Calloway floating face down approximately 30 yards from the point of attack. Her left leg had been severed below the knee, and catastrophic bite wounds extended across her hip and lower torso. Massive blood loss had rendered her unresponsive. Emergency medical personnel met the jet ski at the shoreline, but Tamsin Calloway was pronounced dead before reaching the hospital. The investigation confirmed that Calloway had entered the water in direct violation of a posted shark advisory and multiple verbal warnings from lifeguard staff. The shark was never identified or captured. Lifeguards and beach management were cleared of all liability, with investigators noting that every reasonable warning had been issued and deliberately ignored. It was October 3, 2016, and the morning sun had barely crested the peaks above Aspen when Rhett Caldera stepped onto his deck, coffee in hand, and spotted the bull moose for the second time that week. What began as casual observation would end with neighbors watching in horror as nature's violence unfolded in suburban Colorado. Rhett Caldera was a 41-year-old hedge fund manager from Denver, known among colleagues for his calculated approach to municipal pension allocations that had quietly accumulated considerable wealth over 15 years. His reputation in finance circles was built on measured risk-taking and confident decision-making, traits that had served him well professionally, but translated poorly to his recent lifestyle aspirations. According to colleagues, 6 months earlier, he had purchased a seasonal property on the outskirts of Aspen, less out of genuine outdoor interest and more to project a rugged outdoorsman image to high-net-worth clients who increasingly valued authenticity over polish. Neighbors later told investigators that Rhett had become fixated on appearing connected to nature, often dismissing local guidance about wildlife boundaries as overprotective. His housekeeper mentioned he had been documenting wildlife encounters on social media. That morning, he told a friend through text about his intention to get closer footage of the moose he had been observing from his balcony, grabbing his phone and a plastic container of apple slices as bait, despite posted community rules and local advisories prohibiting feeding wildlife. Bull moose can weigh up to 1,500 pounds and stand 7 feet tall at the shoulder, with antlers spanning 6 feet that serve as both weapons and battering rams. During autumn rut season, testosterone levels spike dramatically, making bulls unpredictably aggressive toward any perceived threat. Unlike bears or mountain lions that typically avoid humans, moose are responsible for more wildlife-related injuries in Colorado than all other species combined. Their preferred defensive strategy involves charging and trampling, using their massive front hooves, each capable of delivering crushing blows, to eliminate threats through sheer force and repetition. That morning, multiple homeowners in the surrounding area had reported a large bull moose lingering near driveways and trash enclosures to local dispatch earlier that morning. Colorado Parks and Wildlife had posted notices throughout the neighborhood 2 days earlier, specifically warning residents not to approach moose during rut season, with particular emphasis on maintaining distance of at least 50 yards. The posted flyers included graphic descriptions of previous incidents and photographs of injuries sustained from moose attacks. Rhett had seen the same animal earlier from his balcony and told his housekeeper he planned to get closer footage before she left for her morning errands. Despite the posted wildlife notices visible on community bulletin boards and his own mailbox, he walked toward the animal holding his phone in one hand and the plastic container of apples in the other, while wearing slick-soled loafers. Witnesses from across the street later told deputies the moose initially stood still near Rhett's driveway, its massive antlers catching morning light, but pinned its ears back flat against its skull as Rhett moved within roughly 15 feet, a clear warning sign of imminent aggression. The moose lunged without further warning, closing the distance in 2 powerful strides. Rhett turned to retreat, but his slick soles slipped on loose gravel as the animal's lowered head drove into his torso with the force of a small vehicle, knocking him violently backward against the side of his parked Range Rover. The impact was audible from across the street, a hollow metallic boom as his body compressed the SUV's door panel inward, leaving a visible dent that investigators later photographed. The moose continued its forward momentum, driving him down beneath its front hooves before pivoting and slamming him onto the pavement. The animal brought a foreleg down with crushing force, then delivered a violent hind leg kick, bringing its full weight down against Rhett's head and shoulders. Rhett attempted to crawl away during a brief pause, his movements weak and uncoordinated, but the moose pivoted and trampled him again. This time, its hooves struck his upper body repeatedly, its weight concentrated through each impact. Blood began pooling beneath his head, spreading across the pale gravel of his driveway. The moose continued its assault, driving another heavy foreleg strike before finally backing away. The entire attack lasted roughly 40 seconds. The animal moved off toward the tree line, leaving Rhett motionless in his driveway, his phone lying several feet away, its screen cracked but still recording toward the morning sky. A neighbor called 911 immediately from her kitchen window, where she had witnessed the entire incident. Paramedics arrived, finding Rhett unresponsive with massive cranial trauma, crushed chest cavity, and severe spinal injuries. He was pronounced dead at the scene at 9:47 a.m. The county coroner's report listed cause of death as massive blunt force trauma to the head, neck, and thorax consistent with trampling, with associated internal hemorrhaging. The report noted extensive crushing injuries consistent with trampling by large ungulate, skull fractures indicating multiple impacts, and chest compression severe enough to cause cardiac arrest. Wildlife officers located and tranquilized the bull moose later that afternoon in nearby woods after initial hazing attempts earlier in the day failed to move it from the residential area. The animal, estimated at 1,200 pounds with a 6-foot antler spread, showed no signs of disease or abnormal behavior and was relocated despite Rhett's daughters protesting for it to be euthanized. Rhett's property was sold quietly within a year through a trust. The driveway resurfaced to remove visible damage. It was March 15, 2017. The East Texas air pressed down, thick with humidity, carrying the smell of damp hay, stagnant water, and animal waste. Enclosures sat under a dull gray sky, metal fencing warm to the touch, while the surrounding trees stood still. The entire ranch heavy, quiet and unmoving. Linda Carver, 46, worked part-time in retail and was deeply involved in her son's school activities, often volunteering for events and trips. She signed up for the field trip so she could stay close to her 12-year-old son and make sure he got the best experience. Before arriving, she had read online complaints about how far visitors were kept from the animals, and she decided she wasn't going to let that limit her day. From the moment they arrived, she started pointing it out, how far everything was, why the kids were being held back, why no one could see anything properly. When staff explained the rules, she talked over them, stepping forward as others stayed back. What was meant to be a simple safety boundary quickly turned into something she was determined to push. The tiger enclosure used an older design, a chain-link fence as the primary barrier, with a wooden rail set several feet back to keep visitors at a safer distance. That gap mattered. Bengal tiger individuals can exceed 400 pounds and generate enough force in a single forelimb strike to pull objects, or limbs, hard against a barrier. They are highly responsive to movement at close range, and repetitive pacing often signals focused attention on activity beyond the enclosure. As the group stopped, a handler instructed everyone to remain behind the rail and avoid the fence. Most visitors stayed back, maintaining distance. Linda didn't. While the handler was still speaking, she stepped forward, guiding her son closer before cutting him off mid-warning, insisting they couldn't see properly from behind the barrier. Ignoring repeated instructions, she moved past the rail, leaving her son behind, and approached the fence. She leaned in, positioning herself within arm's reach, attempting to draw the tiger's attention. Inside the enclosure, the tiger's pacing slowed, then stopped entirely. Its head turned, aligning directly with her position. The shift was immediate and focused, its body squared toward the fence, muscles tightening beneath the coat as it tracked her hand movements. The handler raised his voice again, issuing a direct command for her to step back. Other visitors began shouting, but she remained in place. Instead of retreating, Linda extended her forearm through one of the fence openings and began moving her hand in short, deliberate motions. That movement closed the distance. The tiger reacted instantly. It surged forward in a short burst and struck through the fence, its forelimb threading between the links. The claws made contact across her forearm, hooking and pulling. The force yanked her arm hard against the chain link, pinning it in place and dragging her upper body forward into the barrier. The metal flexed under the impact as she tried to pull back, but the angle trapped her limb. Before she could free herself, the tiger lunged again, this time with its jaws. It clamped down on her forearm through the fence, compressing it against the metal links. The bite force crushed bone and tore through muscle and connective tissue. The pressure drove her arm deeper into the fencing, worsening the structural damage as the animal adjusted its grip. She screamed and tried to pull away, grabbing the fence with her other hand for leverage, but that only fixed her position. The tiger maintained its hold for several seconds, applying sustained pressure, consistent with a close-range bite through a barrier where a full reposition wasn't possible. When it was finally released, the damage was already severe. Linda collapsed immediately, falling backward away from the fence. Her forearm had sustained catastrophic trauma, deep lacerations, crushing fractures, and extensive tearing of soft tissue, including major blood vessels. Blood loss was rapid and difficult to control, with the likely involvement of the brachial artery causing heavy arterial bleeding. People rushed forward as the handler secured the area and called for help. Pressure was applied, but the injury was too severe to control. Within minutes, Linda's condition declined as blood loss and shock progressed. Emergency services were delayed by the location. She lost consciousness and succumbed to blood loss before advanced care could be provided. The cause of death was a massive hemorrhage from traumatic injury to the brachial artery and surrounding tissue. The investigation found the tiger acted within normal behavior, responding to movement within reach of the enclosure. After the incident, the facility increased visitor distance, reinforced barriers, and tightened safety enforcement. It was August 4th, 2014, and the late afternoon sun hung heavy over the Everglades National Park, casting long shadows across the murky canal water where Tamsin Crowell stood at the edge of the observation pull-off. Birds flitted between mangroves, and the occasional splash hinted at unseen movement below the dark surface. Tamsin was a 36-year-old real estate office manager from Tampa, known among her colleagues for her sharp tongue and an unwavering conviction that rules applied to other people. Her sister later described her as someone who always needed to be right, who would argue a point long past the time everyone else had moved on. She had taken this week off to vacation with extended family at a rental property near the park. Her vacation, she insisted, was meant to combine relaxation with authentic wildlife photography, and friends said that she carried herself with the confidence of someone certain she could charm, negotiate, or control any situation. That afternoon, she had insisted on stopping at this particular canal overlook, despite her brother-in-law's repeated suggestion that they move along to one of the designated viewing areas clearly marked for wildlife observation. She carried a bag of marshmallows she had purchased earlier that day from a roadside shop, explaining to her niece that they were specifically meant to help attract animals closer for better photographs. She spoke casually about how the white color would stand out against the dark water and vegetation, making it easier to draw attention from whatever might be lurking below the surface. What Tamsin likely didn't understand was the prehistoric predator that dominated these waters. American alligators can grow up to 15 feet long and weigh over 1,000 pounds, with males in this region averaging 11 to 12 feet. Their bite force measures approximately 2,980 pounds per square inch, among the most powerful of any animal on Earth. They are ambush predators, capable of explosive acceleration from nearly complete stillness, with stealth and patience honed over millennia. Specialized sensory organs along their jaws can detect minute vibrations in the water, enabling them to pinpoint struggling prey even in low visibility. Even the faintest ripple can trigger predatory instincts. Posted warnings explained that feeding alligators was not only illegal, but created a direct threat to human safety. Tamsin had read these aloud in a mocking voice to her family members before opening the bag of marshmallows. She began tossing them toward the water, each one landing with a soft plop. Several alligators that had been floating at a distance began moving closer. A tourist from the adjacent parking area approached and told Tamsin she needed to stop immediately. What followed was a loud argument, with Tamsin insisting she knew what she was doing and accusing the man of being paranoid. Her voice rose in pitch and volume as she threw another handful of marshmallows, this time directly at the nearest alligator. The splashing and shouting drew more attention from both tourists and wildlife. At least 4 large alligators had now closed in toward the bank, their bodies creating V-shaped wakes as they moved through the water with focused, deliberate motion. The attack happened so suddenly that several witnesses later struggled to describe the exact sequence. A massive alligator, later measured at just over 12 feet, lunged from the bank with explosive force. Its jaws clamped onto Tamsin's right forearm with an audible crack as bone shattered instantly beneath the pressure. Tamsin's scream tore across the waterway, raw and piercing. The alligator immediately initiated a death roll, a hunting technique where the predator rotates rapidly along its longitudinal axis to tear flesh and disorient prey. The violent twisting motion caused severe traumatic amputation, with near-complete avulsion of Tamsin's arm below the elbow, bone fragments exposed, and tissue torn in ragged strips. Witnesses described hearing wet tearing sounds and Tamsin screaming, reaching a pitch that several said they would never forget. The violent thrashing drew the other alligators toward the disturbance, competing for position in a rare scenario where multiple adult alligators engaged the same human simultaneously, a phenomenon noted by wildlife experts as extremely uncommon outside of deliberate feeding or provocation. Before anyone could react, the alligator dragged Tamsin into the canal. She went under briefly, then surfaced, her left arm flailing as she tried to grab onto the bank. A second alligator struck from her left side, its jaws closing around her ribcage. Tamsin's legs kicked violently above the water's surface for several seconds, her body jerking in different directions as more than one alligator maintained a grip during the struggle. The water churned violently, thick with sediment and blood. Witnesses could see Tamsin's body being pulled deeper, the thrashing growing weaker. Her head surfaced once more, her mouth open but producing no sound, before she went under again. The churning continued for nearly 20 seconds, then abruptly went still. Tamsin did not resurface. The entire attack, from initial strike to final submersion, a bystander had dialed 911 within seconds of the initial lunge. Park rangers arrived 14 minutes later, followed quickly by wildlife officers. The pull-off was immediately cleared and cordoned off as rangers separated witnesses and began collecting statements. Recovery divers located Tamsin's body nearly an hour later, approximately 200 yards downstream, a distance attributed to a slow current and the movement of multiple animals during the frenzied attack caught in submerged vegetation. The medical examiner's preliminary report indicated massive trauma to the right arm with severe traumatic amputation below the elbow, multiple rib fractures with puncture wounds consistent with alligator dentition, and drowning as the likely cause of death. The alligator responsible was trapped and euthanized within 24 hours. 3 other large alligators in the immediate area were also removed due to documented aggressive behavior toward the recovery team. Wildlife officials noted that the feeding behavior had clearly conditioned multiple animals to associate humans with food, creating an immediate danger that required removal rather than relocation. It was June 8, 2015, and the golden evening light stretched across the sprawling 200-acre ranch outside San Antonio, Texas, as Robert Castellanos made his way toward the exotic animal compound he had built with his construction fortune. The 45-year-old magnate had spent the last decade transforming his property into what he called his personal wildlife sanctuary, complete with approved enclosures housing some of the world's most dangerous predators. The compound sat nestled among rolling hills dotted with mesquite trees, far from the commercial developments that had made Bobby one of South Texas's most successful contractors. Bobby had built his empire from nothing, starting with a single bulldozer and growing his company into a multi-million-dollar operation specializing in shopping centers and office complexes across the region. His success had afforded him the luxury of pursuing his childhood fascination with big cats, leading him to obtain the necessary permits and construct professional-grade facilities that rivaled many accredited zoos. The compound housed 6 exotic cats, including tigers, leopards, and his prized possession, a magnificent 400-pound African lion named Caesar. The ranch employed 2 experienced handlers who maintained strict safety protocols, but Bobby's growing confidence around the animals had led him to bend the rules more frequently in recent months. His staff had noticed Caesar's increasing aggression during the current mating season, with the massive male displaying territorial behaviors that made even the veteran handlers more cautious. Bobby, however, dismissed their concerns, believing his daily interactions with Caesar had created a special bond that transcended the animal's wild instincts. What his handlers didn't know was that Bobby had been secretly entering enclosures during their lunch breaks, taking selfies with the cats to impress potential investors who toured the facility. These unauthorized visits had become increasingly frequent, with Bobby developing a dangerous routine of testing how close he could get to each animal without triggering defensive responses. The construction magnate's overconfidence stemmed from a childhood spent on his grandfather's cattle ranch, where he had learned to handle unpredictable livestock with apparent ease. Bobby often boasted to visitors about his natural ability to read animal behavior, claiming he could sense when predators were agitated or calm. His success in business had reinforced his belief that he possessed special insights that others lacked, leading him to gradually ignore the safety protocols his own money had helped establish. The ranch's insurance company had recently conducted an inspection, noting several minor violations that Bobby had promised to address, but had largely forgotten about in his busy schedule. African lions are apex predators, weighing up to 420 pounds, with males possessing incredible strength and lightning-fast reflexes that make them capable of taking down prey much larger than themselves. These social cats live in complex hierarchical structures and are highly territorial, particularly males who must constantly defend their position through displays of dominance and aggression. During mating season, male lions become especially unpredictable, with testosterone-driven behaviors that can trigger sudden attacks even against familiar humans. Their powerful jaws can deliver a bite force exceeding 650 pounds per square inch, while their retractable claws are designed to grip and tear flesh with devastating efficiency. As Bobby approached Caesar's enclosure that evening, he noticed the automatic water system had malfunctioned, leaving the lion's drinking trough nearly empty in the oppressive Texas heat. His primary handler had driven into town for supplies and wouldn't return for at least an hour, but Bobby couldn't bear the thought of Caesar suffering from dehydration while he waited. The construction magnate had entered the enclosure dozens of times before during routine maintenance, always following lockout procedures that ensured the lion was secured in a separate section. Bobby's fatal oversight came when he failed to verify that the interior gate between the enclosure sections had been properly secured after maintenance work earlier that day. A worker had left the heavy steel barrier partially open, a gap of less than 18 inches that appeared closed from Bobby's viewing angle, but provided enough space for the massive lion to squeeze through. Bobby unlocked the service entrance and stepped into what he believed was the secure section of the compound, carrying a garden hose to manually refill the water system. The attack began the moment Bobby bent over the water trough with his back turned to the interior of the enclosure. Caesar had silently moved moved through the gap in the barrier, his padded paws making no sound on the concrete floor as he approached the unsuspecting human who had invaded his territory. The lion's predatory instincts activated instantly when Bobby's vulnerable position triggered Caesar's hunting response, the massive cat covering the 20 feet between them in less than 3 seconds. Caesar's 400-pound frame struck Bobby with the force of a small vehicle, driving him face first into the concrete wall beside the water trough. The lion's massive jaws clamped down on Bobby's neck and head, his 4-inch canine teeth puncturing through major arteries while applying crushing pressure that damaged the cervical vertebrae. Bobby's body convulsed as Caesar's powerful bite severed the carotid arteries and compressed his airway, causing rapid blood loss and asphyxiation that led to immediate incapacitation. The lion maintained his deadly grip for nearly a minute as Bobby's struggles quickly weakened, Caesar's territorial instincts driving him to ensure complete submission of the perceived threat. The massive cat's razor-sharp claws raked across Bobby's back and shoulders during the brief struggle, opening deep gashes while his crushing bite continued to restrict blood flow and breathing. Bobby's movements ceased within 90 seconds as the combination of severe blood loss and oxygen deprivation overwhelmed his system, his body going limp in Caesar's powerful jaws. Caesar released his grip only after Bobby had been motionless for several moments, the lion's instincts confirming that the intruder no longer posed any challenge to his dominance. The massive predator retreated to the far corner of the enclosure, his territorial display complete as he settled into a watchful position near the barrier gap through which he had entered. Bobby's handler discovered the scene upon returning from town 2 hours later, immediately calling emergency services and wildlife authorities to report the incident. The investigation revealed the maintenance oversight that had left the interior gate unsecured, though officials noted that Bobby had violated standard safety protocols by entering the enclosure alone. Caesar was tranquilized and relocated to an accredited sanctuary in Colorado, where he would live under enhanced security measures designed to prevent similar incidents. The tragedy prompted immediate reviews of private exotic animal facilities across Texas, with new regulations requiring redundant safety systems and mandatory buddy protocols for all enclosure entries. Bobby's construction company established a wildlife conservation fund in his memory, ensuring that his passion for big cats would continue supporting legitimate conservation efforts. His death became a stark reminder that wealth and good intentions cannot overcome the fundamental reality that wild animals remain wild, regardless of human familiarity. It was November 3rd, 2017, when the first hard frost settled over rural Montana, coating the grasslands outside the small town of Shelby in a thin layer of white that crunched underfoot. The roadside circus was little more than a cluster of aging trailers and portable animal pens arranged across 5 acres of leased land along a frontage road. The operation relied heavily on summer tourism and struggled to remain solvent once colder weather arrived. Stetson Braddock was a 29-year-old animal handler who had worked for the family-run circus since leaving community college 6 years earlier. His father had managed the operation before him, passing down animal handling methods through observation and repetition rather than formal certification. Stetson had helped raise the circus's grizzly bear from a cub 5 years earlier and believed that familiarity reduced the risk of serious incident. During the winter months, the circus maintained only a handful of animals on site, including the grizzly bear, several horses, and 2 miniature donkeys. The bear was housed in a reinforced enclosure constructed from welded steel livestock panels and heavy-gauge chain-link fencing, measuring approximately 20 feet by 20 feet, with a concrete base and a small wooden shelter positioned along the rear wall. In the weeks leading into November, feeding schedules had become inconsistent as the circus prepared for winter shutdown. While the bear was still being fed daily, portions had been reduced, and the nutritional quality of the meals had declined due to financial constraints. Investigators later noted that the caloric intake fell short of what a grizzly typically requires in late autumn. Grizzly bears in Montana commonly weigh between 400 and 790 pounds, depending on age and seasonal condition. In late fall, they enter a phase known as hyperphagia, during which their bodies drive them to consume significantly more calories in preparation for winter denning. This phase does not inherently increase aggression, but it heightens food motivation and reduces tolerance around food sources. A grizzly's bite force exceeds 1,100 pounds per square inch, and their forelimbs can deliver disabling blows. Once engaged in an attack, they rely on crushing force, repeated bites, and body weight to subdue threats. The afternoon feeding was scheduled for approximately 4:30 p.m. Stetson carried a 5-gallon bucket containing an estimated 25 to 30 pounds of mixed food, including surplus produce from a local grocery store, raw chicken pieces, and commercial kibble. He entered the enclosure through a gate secured with a chain and padlock. According to family protocol, handlers remained inside during feeding to demonstrate control and maintain proximity to the animal. The bear had been pacing along the perimeter before Stetson entered, alert to the scent of food. When the bucket's contents were emptied into a metal trough mounted against the enclosure wall, the bear moved toward it quickly and began eating. Stetson turned toward the gate, intending to exit once the bear was occupied. The bear consumed the food rapidly and soon lifted its head, orienting toward Stetson as he worked the chain with his back partially turned. The attack began with a powerful swipe from the bear's right forepaw, striking Stetson across the upper back and shoulders. The impact drove him forward into the steel frame of the gate. Before he could regain balance, the bear lunged and clamped its jaws around the back of his neck and shoulder. The bite delivered crushing force, severely damaging soft tissue and the bones of the neck. Stetson collapsed to the concrete surface. The bear released briefly, then re-engaged, biting into his side and ribcage while pinning him with its forelimbs. The attack lasted under a minute as the bear applied repeated bites and weight. Stetson's mother, Carol Braddock, 56, had been inside the office trailer approximately 100 yards away. The hum of a portable generator masked any sounds from the enclosure. When Stetson did not return within several minutes, she walked toward the pen to check on him. She arrived to find the bear positioned over Stetson's body near the rear corner of the enclosure. The animal had begun feeding. Carol retreated immediately and contacted emergency services. Sheriff's deputies arrived within approximately 12 minutes. Assessing the situation as an active threat in a confined space, a deputy used a patrol rifle to dispatch the bear before responders entered the enclosure to recover the body. Investigators determined that Stetson had sustained catastrophic neck trauma, severe internal injuries, and rapid blood loss. The combination of crushing force and continued mauling would have led to rapid loss of consciousness. He was pronounced deceased at the scene. State wildlife authorities and county labor officials cited the circus for unsafe animal handling practices, including the policy of entering the enclosure during feeding and inadequate separation protocols. The operation ceased permanently following the incident. It was June 15, 2015. In a fenced pedestrian viewing area outside Rapid City, dry summer wind moved across open prairie as visitors leaned against steel rails designed to separate foot traffic from the wide grass beyond. One man stepped over the boundary, leaving packed gravel for uneven ground, and the empty stretch ahead suddenly became dangerously exposed. Bram Kellen was 32, a warehouse shift lead from a northeastern Wyoming town. He managed inventory teams overnight and spent his weekends driving to state parks and roadside attractions to clear his head. After a recent breakup, co-workers noticed a change. He had begun filming small dares, climbing restricted structures, standing closer than advised to wildlife, posting short clips with captions about being built different. He was not reckless in daily life. He showed up on time, trained new hires, and kept detailed spreadsheets. But outside work, the risks were growing. A privately operated wildlife park outside Rapid City had been on his list for months. The drive-through loop allowed close vehicle views of elk and bison, and a separate fenced walk-through zone offered a safer vantage point. Bram told a friend he wanted better footage than the usual car window shots. He arrived late morning, paid for entry, and spent nearly an hour along the pedestrian rail watching grazing animals across the interior setback. Beyond the fence, the rolling grassland sloped gently toward a solitary mature bull bison. Adult bulls can exceed 6 feet at the shoulder and weigh over 1,800 pounds, with short curved horns and a heavy skull shielded by thick bone and muscle. Despite their size, they can accelerate to 30 miles per hour in short bursts and pivot quickly. Their flight zone varies, but direct approach inside approximately 20 to 30 feet often triggers defensive behavior. Raised tail, lowered head, pawing, or short ground strikes are established warning signals. Unlike cattle, they do not tolerate close human pressure on open ground and may charge when escape space feels limited. Signage along the rail stated that crossing barriers could result in serious injury or death, and that bison can outrun humans over short distances. Visitors had earlier been verbally reminded by staff to remain behind the primary fence. When Bram began joking that they were just cows with better publicity, several people near him told him to step back from the rail. The bull lifted its head once, oriented briefly toward him, then resumed grazing while maintaining awareness. Without further hesitation, Bram climbed over the pedestrian barrier and dropped into the restricted interior setback. The drop was about 3 feet onto open grass. Several visitors shouted for him to return. Bram walked across the open field, closing the distance from roughly 25 yards to under 15 in less than half a minute. At approximately 25 feet, he clapped and shouted. The bull's posture changed immediately. Its head lowered slightly. The shoulders rolled forward. One forehoof struck the ground in a short, forceful stomp. The tail rose stiffly. These signals are widely documented as pre-charge indicators. Bram stepped closer again, reducing the distance to roughly 15 feet. Arms raised. The charge began abruptly. From that range, the bull covered the distance in under 2 seconds. The impact was blunt and forceful, as the animal's frontal boss and horn base struck Bram in the lower torso and upper thigh. The upward momentum lifted him partially off the ground and threw him backward several feet. He landed on his back. Before he could regain footing, the bull followed through. Rather than repeatedly goring, which is less common in brief defensive encounters, the animal's horn caught beneath his lower rib margin during the forward surge, tearing clothing and penetrating the lower chest wall. The animal's mass carried across him. One forehoof struck across his abdomen as it stepped through, and a hind hoof clipped his pelvis during the stride. The entire contact sequence lasted only a few seconds before the bull continued past him. Bram attempted to inhale. His mouth opened, but no coherent speech followed. Blood appeared at his lips, consistent with internal thoracic injury. The bull moved several yards away and stopped, facing outward but no longer engaging. A bystander ran toward the pedestrian exit and alerted on-site personnel. A call for emergency services was placed within approximately 1 minute of impact. Staff entered the perimeter in utility vehicles, using engine noise and positioning to increase distance between the bull and the injured man without provoking further agitation. They reached Bram in roughly 4 minutes. He was unresponsive. A carotid pulse was faint and then absent. Basic life support was initiated, including chest compressions and attempts to control visible bleeding. Given the severity of internal trauma, survival likelihood was already low at this stage. Emergency medical responders arrived approximately 12 to 15 minutes after dispatch, consistent with rural response intervals. Advanced airway placement and intravenous access were attempted. Ventilation was difficult due to suspected bilateral lung injury and chest wall instability. He was pronounced deceased shortly thereafter. The coroner listed the cause of death as blunt force and penetrating trauma to the chest and abdomen due to bison impact and trampling. Injuries included multiple rib fractures, pulmonary contusions with likely lung puncture, liver laceration, significant internal hemorrhage, and thoracic compression, consistent with a high-mass ungulate strike. A single penetrating wound was attributed to incidental horn contact during forward momentum rather than repeated goring. Cardiac arrest occurred within minutes of injury. The pedestrian viewing zone is closed temporarily. A secondary setback barrier was later extended to increase the separation distance between visitors and large ungulates. Updated signage emphasized reaction speed and minimum safe distances. The bull remained in the habitat, and the incident was classified as a defensive response to a human breach of space. Local coverage was brief, focusing on barrier violation and wildlife safety. No action was taken against the bison, as the behavior aligned with established defensive patterns. It was February 27, 2018, in the vast wilderness of Everglades National Park, Florida, where over 1.5 million acres of subtropical wetlands create one of America's most dangerous ecosystems. This UNESCO World Heritage Site encompasses sawgrass marshes, cypress swamps, and mangrove forests that serve as home to one of North America's most formidable predators. Clara Dale, a 52-year-old high school biology teacher from Miami, had dedicated her career to inspiring students through hands-on learning experiences. As a cautious educator who always prioritized student safety, Clara planned to scout locations for an upcoming field trip that would allow her advanced biology students to observe wetland ecosystems firsthand. Clara had chosen to visit during late February because she believed cooler winter temperatures would make wildlife less active and safer for student observation. However, her timing coincided with the early mating season, a period when American alligators become more territorial and unpredictable due to heightened hormonal activity. The specific area Clara selected featured elevated wooden boardwalks that allowed visitors to observe wildlife while maintaining safe distances from the water. These boardwalks had been constructed by the National Park Service to prevent dangerous encounters between visitors and the park's numerous alligators. The American alligator represents one of North America's most successful conservation stories, having recovered from near extinction to current populations exceeding 1 million individuals. Adult females typically reach lengths of 8 to 9 feet and can weigh between 154 and 198 pounds. During the mating season, female alligators aggressively defend preferred territory and may attack perceived intruders without warning. Unlike crocodiles, American alligators are generally less aggressive toward humans and rarely initiate unprovoked attacks. However, during nesting season, Their behavior changes dramatically as maternal instincts override their typical avoidance of human contact. American alligators possess powerful jaws, capable of delivering bite forces exceeding 2,125 pounds per square inch, strong enough to crush turtle shells and break bones instantly. On that fateful morning, Clara walked along the designated wooden boardwalk, taking detailed notes about sight lines, safety barriers, and potential educational opportunities. She carried a waterproof notebook and camera to document various species she observed. As Clara reached a section overlooking a particularly scenic marsh area, she noticed that recent flooding had submerged parts of the marsh just beyond the boardwalk. Believing the shallow water would allow closer ecological observation, she made the fatal decision to step off the designated boardwalk at a low, unrailed section and wade into knee-deep water. Unknown to Clara, she had entered the territory of an 8-foot female American alligator that had recently selected this area as her nesting site. The female had been resting motionless among the vegetation, perfectly camouflaged and virtually invisible. Clara's movement into the water triggered the alligator's protective instincts. The alligator surged through the shallow water with explosive speed, closing the distance to Clara in seconds. The attack came without warning as the massive reptile launched herself from the water with tremendous force. Powerful jaws clamped down on Clara's lower left leg just below the knee, crushing bone and shredding muscle. The initial bite force compressed Clara's leg bones into fragments, while the alligator's conical teeth penetrated deep into the surrounding muscle tissue. The crushing pressure severed major blood vessels in her lower leg, causing immediate and severe bleeding that turned the marsh water red. The alligator immediately began a violent thrashing motion, shaking her massive head from side to side while maintaining her grip on Clara's leg. This thrashing technique tore Clara's leg muscles and tendons while simultaneously pulling her off balance and into deeper water. As Clara lost her balance during the thrashing attack, she fell backward, her head striking submerged debris as she was pulled off balance. The impact fractured her skull at the temporal bone, causing immediate brain trauma and loss of consciousness. Blood from the head wound mixed with the water as Clara's body went limp. The alligator continued the attack, dragging Clara's unconscious body into deeper water, where sustained submersion ensured drowning. Clara's damaged lungs filled with water as the alligator maintained her grip, ensuring that drowning completed what the physical trauma had begun. Park visitors discovered Clara's abandoned rental car when she failed to return by evening. Her detailed field notebook, found on the boardwalk near the attack site, helped investigators reconstruct the events. Authorities launched an investigation into the incident. Clara's death shocked the community and prompted discussions about the risks associated with field trip planning in natural environments. Her family established a scholarship fund in her memory to support students pursuing careers in environmental education. It was March 7th, 2015. In rural Angelina County outside Lufkin, a gated estate sat under mild morning sun, its rear compound enclosed by tall chain-link fencing, reinforced with welded panels. A single interior service gate opened directly into a packed dirt enclosure, with no secondary barrier or holding corridor to create separation. Darrow Petch was 47, a commercial real estate investor who built his portfolio by buying distressed warehouses after 2008 and converting them into long-term leases. Financially secure, he inherited 14 wooded acres in 2003 and later expanded the property into a gated estate with outbuildings, cameras, and a reinforced animal compound behind the main house. Exotic animal ownership was a private pursuit. He did not operate a public zoo, but hosted guests and associates on weekends. The centerpiece was Coda, a male Bengal tiger acquired in 2006 from a USDA-licensed breeder. Darrow maintained state registration for a dangerous wild animal and carried liability insurance, but had no formal big cat handling certification. For 9 years he fed, cleaned, and occasionally entered the enclosure while the tiger was present. No serious incident had occurred. Repetition became proof to him that the risk was manageable. He was separated from his wife, Lena. Their daughter, Maisie, 9, stayed every other weekend and was familiar with feeding routines. In the months before the incident, Darrow watched videos of private handlers standing near adult tigers without secondary barriers. He spoke about showing that Coda recognized him. He believed a fed tiger was predictable. The enclosure met minimum height requirements, roughly 12 feet tall set into concrete footings, but lacked a double-door safety vestibule at the service entry. Access depended on a single latched gate and routine. Adult male Bengal tigers commonly exceed 400 pounds and can generate bite forces strong enough to crush bone. Their forelimbs are built to knock prey off balance and hold it while delivering a suffocating or cervical bite. Feeding reduces hunger, but does not eliminate predatory reflexes or territorial responses. A crouched human at close range lowers their profile and can trigger a rapid strike covering several yards in under a second. At 10:50 a.m. before scheduled visitors, Darrow fed Kota raw chicken and beef trim through the secured feed slot. He told Maisie to remain near the house. A 16-year-old groundskeeper was spreading gravel near the driveway. Darrow carried a rake to the rear service gate, unlocked the exterior padlock, entered, and latched it behind him. Kota lay along the far fence line. Darrow crouched near the center of the enclosure with the rake beside him, shoulders angled forward, speaking in a low tone. From outside the fence, nothing appeared unusual. The tiger rose and walked toward him, quiet and controlled. He closed the gap and leaned in, drawing scent from Darrow's hands and clothing. Then the posture shifted. Kota stepped back slightly. His head dipped below shoulder height. Ears rotated outward and flattened. Muscles along his shoulders tightened. His weight shifted onto his hindquarters. Darrow remained crouched. The groundskeeper later described a brief pause before the forward surge. The tiger covered the distance in one bound and struck high, jaws locking across the left shoulder and base of the neck. The impact drove Darrow sideways onto the dirt. The bite held. Kota anchored with his forelimbs and pulled backward several yards, hind claws carving furrows in the soil. Darrow's right arm struck toward the tiger's face without effect. The tiger remained low, maintaining grip rather than thrashing. Pinned near the fence, Kota adjusted his bite slightly higher along the lateral neck. Witnesses described Darrow's movements slowing within seconds. Blood spread rapidly beneath his torso. The groundskeeper ran toward the house, shouting. Maisie moved toward the enclosure, then turned and ran inside to call 911 as instructed for emergencies. Kota maintained jaw pressure and braced over Darrow's chest. The bite placement and the animal's weight restricted breathing and major blood flow. Visible movement ceased shortly afterward. After less than a minute, the tiger released and stepped back, pacing once before lying near the far wall. At approximately 11:07 a.m., Maisie reached 911 and provided the address, stating her father was inside the enclosure. Deputies arrived within 20 to 25 minutes. Emergency medical services followed. Responders secured a perimeter and assessed from outside the fence. Because the tiger remained unrestrained, entry was delayed until additional units arrived with tranquilizer support from a contracted wildlife officer. When Kota settled at the far end and was monitored, responders opened the service gate, entered, and extracted Darrow. He was pronounced dead at the scene shortly after noon. The county coroner documented catastrophic bite trauma to the upper shoulder and lateral neck, severe vascular injury, rapid blood loss, and airway compromise. Findings were consistent with a single high-placement predatory mauling by a large felid, with no evidence of prolonged feeding or multiple attack cycles. State wildlife authorities reviewed the property's registration and enclosure compliance. Kota was sedated and euthanized later that day due to the fatal attack and public safety risk. The remaining animals were transferred to licensed facilities. No criminal charges were filed. Maisie relocated to her mother's residence. The enclosure soil was removed and replaced, and the compound was left empty. It was June 17, 2018, and the afternoon sun cast sharp shadows across the forested trail at Yellowstone National Park. Within the hour, the ground beneath that trail would be stained with blood, and Maribel Hoxie would become another statistic in a preventable tragedy. Maribel was a 41-year-old administrative assistant from Reno, Nevada, known among her co-workers at the insurance firm for two things: her combative personality and her recent obsession with social media photography. She had never been to Yellowstone before this trip, but for months, friends said that she had been planning what she called her wildlife photography expedition. She had printed maps, bookmarked animal behavior guides, and even bought a new telephoto lens, obsessively commenting online about capturing Yellowstone in its rawest, wildest form. Her excitement was matched only by her impatience for authority, a trait friends had long found frustrating. That morning, Maribel had already clashed with park staff at the visitor center over the park's guidance, requiring visitors to remain at least 100 yards away from bears. She had called it ridiculous and accused rangers of fear-mongering to justify their jobs. Her traveling companion, a co-worker named Lynn, later told investigators that Maribel spent the drive to the trailhead, complaining about government overreach and insisting that bears could sense human intentions. Lynn, an otherwise cautious and rule-abiding person, recalled feeling a creeping dread as Maribel laughed off every caution, snapping photos of road signs and writing sarcastic captions on her phone. The trail they approached that afternoon wound through a section of dense forest adjacent to a fast-moving river, the kind of terrain grizzlies favored for fishing and foraging. The air carried the earthy scent of pine and damp soil. The sound of rushing water masked other noises, a fact well documented in wildlife studies as increasing the risk of surprise encounters. But Maribel barely noticed, focused entirely on capturing perfect angles and lighting. Grizzly bears are among North America's most powerful predators, with males weighing up to 800 pounds and females typically reaching 400 pounds. They can sprint at speeds exceeding 30 miles per hour over short distances, and their 4-inch claws are designed for digging, climbing, and tearing. Despite their size, they can pivot on steep slopes and uneven terrain with surprising agility, a fact well documented in wildlife studies, but one Maribel dismissed as exaggeration. The trail ahead was blocked with yellow rope and multiple warning signs. 2 rangers stood positioned at the closure, addressing a small group of tourists and explaining that a large adult bear had been repeatedly seen defending its favored feeding and bedding area in the immediate vicinity. Witnesses later reported that Maribel arrived during this briefing and immediately began talking loudly, interrupting the ranger to call the warnings fear tactics designed to control tourists. As the ranger continued speaking, movement appeared through the pine trees near the riverbank. The bear emerged, a massive brown form moving with deliberate awareness of the humans, scanning its surroundings and asserting control over its territory. Most of the tourists complied immediately to what they believed was a safe distance. Maribel did the opposite. She loudly declared the warnings exaggerated and ducked under the rope barrier, walking directly toward the bear with her phone raised. The ranger shouted for her to stop. Maribel continued forward, her attention fixed on her phone screen as she framed the shot. The rangers, positioned behind the rope and surrounded by tourists, were limited by park protocol and safety constraints. The bear was already within critical distance, and deploying spray risked escalating the situation amid fleeing tourists. The bear covered the distance in a few seconds. The charge happened with shocking speed, its massive body accelerating with explosive power, refined by evolution. Maribel had just begun to lower her phone when the bear hit her. The impact was like a car collision. The bear's massive paw swung in a devastating arc, striking Maribel's upper body with enough force to lift her off her feet before driving her backward onto the rocky ground. The bear was on her instantly, its weight, approximately 400 pounds, pinning her flat. What followed was brutal. The bear's jaws closed around Maribel's head and neck. Blood spilled rapidly across the dirt and rocks as teeth punctured major blood vessels in Maribel's neck. Her arms flailed briefly, hands striking uselessly against the bear's massive shoulder. Maribel's movements had ceased by this point, though whether from shock, blood loss, or catastrophic injury was impossible to determine from observation alone. The bear delivered 2 more bites to Maribel's upper body, focused on neutralizing the threat before suddenly disengaging. The entire attack had lasted just under a minute. The bear lingered briefly to ensure the intruder had left its territory before retreating into the trees. The ranger radioed for emergency response within seconds of the bear's retreat. Park medics, already staged within the park due to the wildlife closure, arrived immediately. The attending medic noted massive blood loss, obvious catastrophic cranial trauma, and severe trauma to the neck and upper torso. Death was pronounced at the scene. The trail remained closed for more than 48 hours, while wildlife officials monitored bear movement in the area. The bear was tracked but not removed or euthanized, as officials determined the attack was a defensive territorial response rather than predatory behavior. It was March 18, 2014, and the vast wetlands of Everglades National Park stretched endlessly under the Florida moon, their dark waters hiding countless dangers beneath the surface. The remote waterways, accessible only by small boats and experienced guides, provided perfect habitat for the apex predators that ruled these ancient swamps. Eddie Ramirez had been fishing these waters for over a decade, but tonight would be his last. Eddie Ramirez had been struggling financially since his divorce 6 months earlier, working construction during the day and fishing the Everglades on weekends to supplement his income. At 35, he had developed developed a reputation among local restaurant owners as someone who could provide fresh fish at competitive prices. No questions asked about licenses or catch limits. His knowledge of the waterways had made him overconfident about the dangers lurking beneath the surface. That evening, Eddie had launched his small aluminum boat from a remote access point, planning to fish through the night in areas where few other anglers ventured. His recent financial troubles had made him increasingly desperate, and he had been taking bigger risks to land more valuable catches. The alimony payments and mounting bills had pushed him to consider opportunities he would have previously avoided. Eddie's fishing spot was in a narrow channel surrounded by dense mangroves, where large fish often fed in the shallow water. He had been using heavy tackle and live bait, hoping to hook something substantial enough to make the night trip worthwhile. What he didn't realize was that his fishing activities had attracted the attention of the channel's most dangerous resident. American alligators are apex predators perfectly adapted to freshwater environments, with adult males reaching lengths of 14 feet and weights exceeding 1,000 pounds. These powerful reptiles possess bite forces of over 2,900 pounds per square inch and are capable of explosive bursts of speed both in water and on land. Alligators are opportunistic feeders that will attack anything they perceive as prey, and their territorial nature makes them particularly dangerous during mating season and when protecting their young. Around midnight, Eddie felt a powerful strike on his line that nearly pulled the rod from his hands. The fish fought with unusual strength and aggression, making runs that stripped line from his reel and threatened to break his heavy tackle. Eddie assumed he had hooked a large tarpon or shark, the kind of catch that could bring serious money from the right buyer. As Eddie fought the fish, his boat began moving through the water in ways that didn't match typical fish behavior. The runs were too straight and powerful, and the fish seemed to be pulling the boat rather than trying to escape. When Eddie finally got his first glimpse of what he had hooked, he realized his mistake too late. The massive alligator thrashed on the surface, its prehistoric form clearly visible in the moonlight as it fought against the hook embedded in its jaw. Eddie should have cut his line immediately, but his financial desperation overrode his common sense. He had heard stories of people selling alligator meat and hide for substantial money, and his mounting bills made the risk seem worthwhile. The 12-foot alligator's rage intensified as Eddie continued to fight it, the hook causing pain and the fishing line restricting its movement. The reptile began rolling and thrashing with increasing violence, its powerful tail striking the water with enough force to create waves that rocked Eddie's small boat. The aluminum hull groaned under the stress of the battle. Eddie's attempts to bring the alligator closer to the boat proved fatal when the enraged reptile launched itself partially out of the water, its massive jaws snapping just feet from where Eddie stood. The sudden movement and weight shift capsized the small aluminum boat, throwing Eddie into the dark water with the angry alligator. In the chaos of the capsizing, Eddie became entangled in his own fishing line as the alligator continued its violent thrashing. The monofilament wrapped around his legs and arms, preventing him from swimming to safety as the massive reptile rolled and spun in the water nearby. Eddie's desperate attempts to free himself only tightened the line's grip. The alligator, still hooked and now even more agitated by Eddie's presence in the water, attacked with devastating force. Its massive jaws clamped down on Eddie's torso, the bone-crushing bite force instantly causing fatal injuries. The reptile's death roll dragged Eddie underwater repeatedly, his struggles growing weaker with each submersion. Eddie's screams echoed across the remote waterway, but the isolated location meant no other fishermen were within miles to hear his cries for help. The alligator continued its attack until Eddie's movement ceased, his body unable to withstand the massive trauma inflicted by the reptile's jaws and the repeated underwater submersions. Eddie's empty boat was discovered floating upside down the following morning by park rangers conducting routine patrols. The scattered fishing equipment and blood on the hull told the story of a violent encounter, and Eddie's body was recovered 2 days later in a nearby channel. The investigation revealed his desperate financial situation and the illegal nature of his fishing activities, highlighting the dangerous lengths to which economic hardship was driving people in the region. It was July 28, 2018. Afternoon fog thinned over the cold, choppy waters off Point Reyes. Swells rolled steadily beneath gray light, and visibility shifted with each passing minute. The surface looked calm from a distance, but movement underneath remained hidden, distorted by depth and glare. Elaine Foster, 52, worked in an office managing schedules and meetings for many years. She was known for being organized and calm, sticking to routines and avoiding risk. Her daily life was predictable and she rarely stepped outside her comfort zone. This boat trip was a birthday surprise from friends, her first time out in open ocean water. She agreed mostly to go along with it. She wasn't fully comfortable on boats, but she trusted the group. Her plan was simple: stay on board, watch, and get through the afternoon. The boat moved slowly through an area known for fish and marine life. The water looked calm from the surface, but below it was active and unpredictable. In these waters, large sharks, especially great whites, regularly pass through, drawn by seals and sea lions that move along the same routes. They don't hunt boats, but they do respond to sudden movement or splashing, especially when something enters the water without warning. Before departure, the captain gave clear instructions. Stay away from the edges, don't lean over. If anything falls in, do not reach for it. At first, Elaine stayed near the center with the others, holding onto the rail and watching from a safe distance. But as the trip went on, she drifted toward the back of the boat. The rear deck sat lower than the rest, only a few feet above the water, and gave a closer view of the surface. She leaned forward against the rail, watching the water move beneath her. Small ripples passed along the surface, reflecting light in shifting patterns. A few of her friends told her to step back, pointing out how close she was getting. The captain repeated the warning from the front. She didn't move. Instead, she shifted her weight forward, trying to get a better angle. A few minutes later, a gust of wind caught her hat and pulled it off her head. It landed in the water just behind the boat and began drifting away slowly. She reacted without thinking. Elaine leaned farther over the rail, reaching down toward the water as the hat floated just out of reach. The boat rocked slightly with the swell beneath it. Her footing shifted on the damp surface. Her center of balance moved too far forward. Then she slipped. Her body tipped over the rail, and she dropped into the water. The fall was short, but the impact was hard enough to knock the air out of her chest. The cold hit immediately. The sudden temperature change triggered an automatic gasp as she surfaced, pulling in water and air at the same time. She came up struggling, her body vertical instead of flat. Her legs kicked unevenly, and her arms pushed down in short, uncoordinated motions. Panic took over almost instantly. Her breathing became fast and uncontrolled, and she wasn't able to steady herself. On the boat, the crew moved quickly. One of them grabbed a flotation ring and threw it toward her. Another started turning the boat around. Voices overlapped, calling out instructions she couldn't process. Below the surface, the sudden splash and erratic movement sent strong signals through the water. Each kick and arm movement created pressure waves that spread outward. A great white shark moving at depth detected the disturbance and changed direction, rising toward the surface. The water around Elaine churned as she struggled to stay above it. Her movements were uneven and loud in the water, exactly the kind of signal that draws attention. The strike came fast. The shark surged upward from below in a direct line, its body moving with speed and force. It hit her from underneath and slightly to the side, jaws opening at the last second. The bite landed across her lower torso and upper leg. The force lifted part of her body out of the water before pulling her under for a brief moment. The pressure of the bite caused immediate damage. The tissue tore under the force, and the impact disrupted major blood vessels. The water around her darkened quickly as blood spread outward. Within seconds, the shark released. This kind of bite was not sustained. It was a single high-force strike, followed by withdrawal. The shark dropped back into deeper water and did not return. Elaine resurfaced briefly, but her movements were already weakening. The crew threw another flotation device and moved the boat into position, but the damage was too severe. She lost strength quickly as blood loss increased. Within minutes, she lost consciousness before she could be brought fully to safety. The crew pulled her alongside the boat, but she could not be revived. The cause of death was massive trauma and rapid blood loss from the initial bite. The investigation found the attack was triggered by her sudden fall and erratic movement, with the shark delivering a single investigative strike under low visibility conditions. It was December 3rd, 2017, and the evening air in Lahore carried the scent of dust and diesel as Xavier Ralph stepped through the inner gate into his cousin's concrete-walled enclosure. He held a wooden stick in one hand and his phone raised in the other, its camera already recording as voices from the courtyard echoed behind him. Xavier was a 22-year-old from one of Lahore's established textile families, the youngest of 3 sons. He had recently begun posting short-form videos that documented a pattern of increasingly reckless stunts performed mainly for his immediate social circle. That evening's gathering was at his cousin Hamza's private compound, on the edge of a newly developed residential extension. The property was surrounded by high-perimeter walls and included an improvised animal enclosure behind a secondary courtyard. Hamza, 10 years older and involved in loosely regulated business ventures, kept a male lion there as a personal status symbol. Despite national wildlife protection laws, private ownership of exotic animals persisted in certain affluent circles. Xavier had visited the compound before and had previously filmed himself standing near the enclosure's outer wall. On this occasion, With several friends present and alcohol circulating, he announced his intention to enter the enclosure itself. Witnesses later said the declaration began as a joke, but quickly shifted into a challenge when Hamza discouraged him. African lions, even young males, can weigh between 330 and 550 pounds, with this particular animal estimated at around 400 pounds. Their canine teeth can reach lengths of 3 inches and are adapted to puncture and hold. Even when raised in captivity, lions retain their predatory reflexes and defensive responses to perceived threats within their space. Hamza initially refused Xavian's request. The lion, named Sher, had been fed earlier that afternoon, but had shown heightened agitation in recent weeks. A handler who visited twice daily had warned that Sher had begun charging the gate during routine feeding. Hamza relayed this warning to Xavian and urged him to remain outside the barrier. Xavian dismissed the concern. When Hamza remained firm, he turned to 2 friends nearby, suggesting the refusal was excessive. In the presence of the group, the conversation shifted tone. The friends, influenced by the atmosphere and alcohol, agreed to assist. The enclosure's side gate was secured with a padlock and chain. Hamza kept a spare key hanging on a hook in the outdoor kitchen. While Hamza stepped inside the house to take a phone call, one of the friends retrieved it. Xavian entered the enclosure with deliberate posture, shoulders back, walking in a wide arc, rather than directly toward the lion. Sher remained in a shaded corner, resting but alert. Xavian spoke loudly toward his phone, explaining to viewers that confidence and vocal presence established dominance. He began slapping the stick against his palm. Sher's ears flattened slightly, and his tail began a slow, repetitive flick. These signs indicated agitation, though Xavian appeared not to recognize them. For nearly 30 seconds, Xavian paced in the center of the enclosure, while Sher remained still. He then struck the concrete floor twice with the stick. The sharp cracks echoed off the walls. He advanced 3 steps while continuing to speak loudly. Sher's body tensed, muscles shifting beneath his coat. Xavian struck the ground again, now roughly 6 feet from the lion. Sher rose to his feet, revealing his full height and mass. Xavian paused briefly, taking a half step backward that was visible in the recording, before moving forward again. He extended the stick as though intending to touch the lion's shoulder. Sher's forepaw struck with sudden speed, knocking the stick aside. It skidded across the concrete and struck the far wall. Xavian stumbled backward. Before he could regain balance, Sher lunged forward in 2 strides. His chest collided with Xavian's torso, driving him downward. As Xavian fell, Sher's jaws closed around his throat. The immediate effect was visible as Xavian's body stiffened. His hands rose toward the lion's head, gripping at the mane and jaw without effect. Sher maintained the hold and dragged Xavian across the enclosure toward the shaded corner. His hind legs pushed against the concrete to adjust his position. After repositioning, Sher delivered a single powerful headshake. Xavian's body became limp. Outside the enclosure, friends had begun shouting during the lunge. Several threw objects, shoes, a metal tray, and other items, over the wall. One friend contacted a private veterinary professional who had previously assisted Hamza. The veterinarian declined to attend without police and a tranquilizer team and advised contacting authorities. Emergency services were called shortly afterward. Local police arrived 27 minutes later. By that time, Sher had released Xavian and retreated to his resting area. Officers secured the compound and requested wildlife authorities. A tranquilizer team arrived nearly an hour after the initial call. Once Sher was sedated, medical personnel entered the enclosure. Xavian was pronounced dead at the scene. Authorities charged Hamza with illegal possession and unsafe containment of a wild animal. Proceedings were resolved quietly through legal negotiations. The compound was closed, and Sher was transferred to a licensed facility. Reports later indicated the lion's health had deteriorated due to long-term confinement, and he died several months afterward. The friends present were physically unharmed, but reportedly avoided discussing the event afterward. Several removed related recordings from their devices. It was September 14, 2015, and the sky above Denali National Park hung low and colorless, the kind of overcast that flattens shadows and makes distances hard to judge. A morning that offered no warmth and no warning before it became the last Soren Falk would ever see. Soren was 29, from Asheville, North Carolina, and had built a following of 4,000 subscribers over 3 years. Her content was built around what she called spiritual rewilding, barefoot hiking, extended fasting in remote terrain, and long monologues about humanity's disconnection from the natural world. She rejected conventional outdoor safety protocols openly and often, framing bear spray and guided access as products of collective fear, rather than practical necessity. Her comment sections were full of people who found her approach liberating. Her family, by most accounts, had quietly stopped watching. The Alaska trip had been announced to her audience 2 weeks prior. She described it as a pilgrimage to witness the late salmon run in what she called the last honest wilderness in America. She had filmed 3 videos in the days before the incident, each pushing closer to active bear feeding areas along a tributary of the Teclanica River. The Teclanica drainage in mid-September is a compressed corridor of urgency. Grizzlies feed with brutal efficiency during the salmon run, consuming up to 20,000 calories per day to build fat reserves before denning. Adult females with cubs are the most unpredictable animals in North American wilderness. A sow grizzly weighs between 250 and 450 pounds, runs at 35 miles per hour, and delivers a bite force exceeding 1,200 pounds per square inch. When protecting cubs, they do not bluff. Park rangers at a visitor center had issued a formal advisory 3 days earlier, warning hikers of elevated bear activity along the Teclanica corridor and recommending groups of 3 or more, accessible bear spray, and a minimum 300-foot buffer from any bear with cubs. A separate hiker, Dara Wolf, 34, from Missoula, Montana, encountered her that same evening at a backcountry campsite. She later told investigators Soren carried no bear spray, no canister, and stated plainly that bears respond to the energy a person brings into their space. On the morning of September 14th, Dara was positioned roughly 240 feet upstream on elevated ground, using a 400mm zoom lens to photograph the river. She observed Soren crouch near the bank approximately 60 feet from a sow and her 2 cubs feeding on a salmon carcass. She had her camera raised. According to Wolf's statement, the sow raised her head within seconds, ears forward, body rigid. There was no bluff charge. She accelerated immediately, covering the 60-foot distance in just over 1 second. The impact knocked Soren onto her back. Wolf said that she, the sow, mounting Soren immediately, driving her face first into the gravel with her forelimbs. The first bite was delivered to the upper back of the skull, a crushing, sustained grip. Her arms moved briefly, fingers opening and closing against the riverbank gravel. The sow released and regripped twice within the first 15 seconds, targeting the neck and base of the skull each time. The bear's cubs remained 15 feet behind their mother. The sow's behavior throughout was focused and methodical. She pinned, bit, shook, and pinned again. Soren's movements ceased entirely within approximately 55 seconds of initial contact. The sow gripped her upper torso and dragged her roughly 8 feet off the trail before releasing and standing over the body. When Wolf and 2 other hikers who had heard her shouting began advancing and shouting, the sow moved her cubs back up the riverbank. Wolf used her satellite communicator to contact Park Dispatch at 9:47 a.m. Rangers reached the location at 11:20 a.m., 1 hour and 33 minutes after the attack. Soren died en route to the hospital. Coroner said that she sustained multiple crushing fractures to the occipital and parietal regions of the skull, consistent with large carnivore bite force. Severe soft tissue destruction to the posterior neck and upper cervical spine. Cause of death listed as craniocerebral trauma with secondary cervical cord transection. Time of death estimated within 2 minutes of initial contact. Rescue teams noted the absence of bear spray and any protective gear, finding only her camera bag crushed under a fallen log. Investigators marked the scene as a textbook example of predictable predator behavior, and in her online communities, her death became a grim punchline. Thousands of comments blaming bad vibes and woo-woo energy for a death that could have been prevented with basic preparation. Her online accounts were taken down later at the request of her family. Denali Rangers used the incident to push for revised backcountry permit requirements in high-activity corridors, a proposal stalled in review for 4 years. It was October 15, 2015. Humid Florida air pressed down over soaked fairways, the marsh edges dark with still water and soft mud. Reeds bent slightly along the bank, and faint slide marks cut through the shoreline where something had moved recently, just beneath the surface. Sharon Whitaker, 49, worked in sales and was known for being persistent and detail-focused, tracking everything and refusing to accept losses, a mindset she carried into golf, where she kept strict scores and grew visibly frustrated when things didn't go her way. Visiting her sister for a short break, she chose a challenging course with the goal of hitting a personal best, but by the back nine, after losing several balls to water and sand, her slipping score only made her more determined not to lose another one. On one hole, a long water hazard ran along the side of the fairway. The dark water looked calm, but warning signs were posted all along the edge. Alligators present. Stay back. And players had already been told that anything near the water should be left alone. When Sharon's shot landed about 15 feet from the edge, her playing partner told her to drop a new ball and take the penalty, but she refused. She stared at the ball for a moment, then stepped off the cart path despite him repeating the warning. The ground was soft from recent rain, and her shoes sank slightly as she moved down the slope. She spotted the ball in the grass and focused on it, adjusting her position as if it were just another routine play. Her partner raised his voice, telling her to come back, but she didn't turn around. Instead, she kept moving closer, lining herself up with the ball and taking her time, brushing off his warnings without even looking back. Just beyond the ball, in the shallow water, a 9-foot American alligator lay almost invisible, with only its eyes and the top of its head above the surface. Her partner saw it clearly and shouted again, louder this time, telling her to back up immediately, but she didn't move. She tried to pull the ball closer using her club, reaching out and dragging at it without stepping any further. When that didn't work, she moved closer anyway, stopping about 5 feet from the water's edge. Still focused on the ball, she tapped the surface with her club, sending vibrations through the water, and that was all it took. The alligator reacted instantly, launching upward in a short, explosive burst and clamping onto the nearest part of her body, her upper leg. The force knocked her off balance and drove her to the ground. Its jaws locked down with crushing pressure, breaking bone and tearing through muscle. The bite damaged major blood vessels in her thigh, including the femoral artery, triggering rapid and severe bleeding. The alligator maintained its grip as it pulled backward toward the water, dragging her across the soft ground. She tried to hold onto the bank, clawing at the mud and grass as her partner rushed toward her. As the animal pulled, it twisted its body in a short, forceful motion, attempting to reposition and gain leverage. The shallow water and uneven terrain limited its ability to perform a full death roll, but the movement increased the tearing force at the point of contact. After several seconds of sustained struggling and resistance, the alligator released its grip, likely due to the awkward angle and lack of depth needed to continue the maneuver, and retreated back into deeper water. Sharon was left at the edge, badly injured and bleeding heavily. Her partner pulled her farther up the bank and called for help while applying pressure to the wound, but the bleeding was severe and difficult to control due to the extent of the vascular damage. She lost consciousness within minutes, as blood loss and shock progressed. Emergency responders arrived shortly after, but her condition had already deteriorated beyond recovery. She was pronounced dead not long after. The cause of death was determined to be massive blood loss resulting from traumatic injury to the femoral artery, along with severe fractures and extensive soft tissue damage to the leg. The investigation found the alligator's behavior consistent with a defensive or opportunistic feeding response to close-range disturbance. There was no indication of abnormal aggression. Following the incident, the area reinforced safety warnings and increased patrol monitoring around water hazards, emphasizing that anything near the water should be left undisturbed. It was September 4th, 2017, when the first frost of autumn dusted the gravel bars along a remote salmon stream deep in Alaska's Katmai region. The Sockeye Run was tapering off, but enough fish remained to draw grizzly bears from across the drainage. A fly-in bear viewing operation ran day trips to the stream, ferrying small groups of visitors by float plane from a lakeside lodge roughly 40 miles to the east. Meredith Langard was a 61-year-old retired corporate attorney from Portland, Oregon, who had built a second career around adventure travel after leaving her firm. Her personality, described by acquaintances as forceful and unyielding, had served her well in courtrooms, but translated poorly to wilderness settings where compliance with guide instructions was a matter of survival. The morning group consisted of Langard and 2 other guests, accompanied by a bush pilot who doubled as the viewing guide. The guide, a 38-year-old Alaska native with 12 years of experience in the Katmai drainage, conducted a thorough briefing at the landing site. National Park Service regulations required a minimum distance of at least 50 yards from bears, with greater distances enforced at the guide's discretion depending on conditions. The guide emphasized that female bears with cubs represented the highest danger and that any approach would be dictated entirely by bear behavior. Langard challenged the buffer distances immediately, calling them excessive and accusing the guide of artificially limiting the experience. She pointed out that she had paid a significant sum for the trip and expected close-range photography opportunities. She told the other guests in the group that she had hiked in grizzly country before and that the distances being enforced were far beyond what was necessary. The guide explained that distance decisions were non-negotiable and based on real-time animal behavior. Langard told him she would be requesting a partial refund and speaking with the lodge owner about the quality of the guiding. The group observed several bears fishing along a shallow riffle for approximately 90 minutes. During a brief rest break, while the guide was attending to another guest's equipment near the riverbank, Langard walked upstream alone along a gravel bar. She rounded a bend and stopped. A female grizzly was fishing with 2 spring cubs at the river's edge, roughly 25 feet away. Langard raised her phone's camera rather than retreating. The wind, wind was blowing downstream, carrying her scent directly toward the bear. The sow detected the scent and visually confirmed the threat almost simultaneously. Grizzly bears are North America's most powerful terrestrial predator, with adult females weighing between 300 and 450 pounds and males exceeding 800 pounds. Despite their bulk, grizzlies can sprint at speeds approaching 35 miles per hour over short distances. A female with cubs will charge with minimal warning when surprised at close range, relying on overwhelming force to neutralize perceived threats. Their claws, measuring up to 4 inches, can open deep lacerations with a single swipe, while their bite force is estimated to exceed 1,200 pounds per square inch. Most defensive attacks are brief but devastating, with the bear disengaging once the threat is neutralized. The sow charged immediately. The distance left virtually no time for an effective reaction. The bear closed the gap in under 2 seconds, striking her with a forepaw that knocked her off her feet and onto the gravel bar. The bear bit down on her shoulder and upper arm, the crushing bite causing severe trauma to the shoulder and upper torso. The bear delivered several mauling bites and swipes in rapid succession before releasing, stepping back to assess whether the threat had ended. Langard lay motionless on the gravel. The bear circled once, snorting, then gathered her cubs and moved upstream at a fast walk. The bear had disengaged quickly, consistent with a defensive response rather than predation. The guide, alerted by the commotion, reached the bend within minutes. Langard was unconscious and bleeding severely from multiple bite and claw injuries concentrated across her face, scalp, arms, and upper body. The guide applied pressure and radioed for an emergency float plane extraction. The nearest trauma center was over an hour away by air. Langard never regained consciousness. She succumbed to her injuries shortly after arrival at the trauma center. While many defensive bear attacks are survivable, the extent of trauma and delayed evacuation contributed to a fatal outcome. The investigation determined that Langard had left the group without authorization and approached a female grizzly with cubs at a distance well inside the minimum safety requirement. The guide and operation were cleared of liability. It was September 14, 2016. Dry wind pushed dust across the rutted roads of a wildlife reserve, where the late morning sun burned through a cloudless sky, flattening the grass into dull gold as heat shimmered above the ground, and stillness settled between scattered acacia trees. One of the tourists that day was Amber Goldfield, 59, a woman who rarely left things to chance. For nearly 20 years, she worked as a housekeeping supervisor, building a reputation for precision, routine, and control. She documented everything: staff routines, family moments, even small, ordinary days, because to her, nothing was too minor to capture. The safari came from a company raffle, her first trip outside the country, and she prepared for it the same way she handled work, carefully, methodically, studying animals and filming techniques before she ever arrived. But once inside the self-drive lion enclosure, that careful mindset didn't last. Amber started complaining almost immediately. The glass was too dirty, the angle was terrible, and the whole setup was not worth the trip. She spoke louder than necessary, repeating the same frustrations as if saying them enough would fix the problem. Other vehicles passed quietly, but Amber kept going, irritated, impatient, and convinced she deserved a better view. She didn't want the usual distant footage most tourists accepted. She wanted something closer, something that felt real, something she could show off. The SUV gave her confidence. To her, it wasn't just a vehicle, it was protection, a barrier she believed made her untouchable, no matter how close she got. The enclosure covered several hundred acres and held a group of 12 lions. The lionesses weighed around 280 pounds and killed prey by clamping down on the throat, compressing the airway and major blood vessels until breathing and circulation stopped. Even in a controlled setting, their instincts didn't change. Anything moving outside a vehicle could be assessed as prey. At the entrance, staff made the rules clear. Windows must stay fully closed. Signs along the road repeated the warning. That morning, one lioness rested in thin grass about 40 feet from the road, watching vehicles move through her space. At first, Amber followed the rules, filming through the closed window while narrating, but the glare and dust on the glass kept ruining her shots. She pointed it out again and again, her tone shifting from annoyed to openly frustrated. She blamed the car, the park, even the cheap setup, saying she didn't come all this way for bad footage. After about 10 minutes, she had had enough. Still complaining, she rolled the window down and extended her arm outside, pushing her phone outward and adjusting the angle repeatedly. The movement drew attention immediately. With part of her body now outside, she was no longer protected. The lioness noticed and stood up, locking onto the motion. It began walking toward the vehicle, slow, direct, and focused. Amber kept filming, only briefly glancing at the animal. not recognizing the change in behavior. When the lioness got close, about 15 feet, it suddenly accelerated. The attack was immediate. The lioness lunged upward, placing its front paws against the door for leverage, and drove its jaws into the side of Amber's neck. The bite compressed her throat and pulled her violently against the window frame. With her upper body already outside, the lioness used its weight and grip to drag her fully out of the vehicle. Once on the ground, it repositioned slightly and maintained a firm hold on her throat, applying sustained pressure. This is how lions kill, by cutting off airflow and restricting blood to the brain. Amber's movements weakened within seconds as oxygen supply dropped. The lioness held its position, focused and controlled. The entire sequence lasted under 2 minutes. Amber's phone remained inside the vehicle, still recording audio. Another car approached but kept its distance and contacted park staff. No one exited their vehicle. Rangers arrived approximately 18 minutes later and used vehicles and noise to push the lioness away. It disengaged and moved off without further aggression. Amber was pronounced dead at the scene. The cause of death was consistent with a fatal throat bite, resulting in rapid oxygen deprivation and vascular compression, along with severe trauma to the neck and upper body. The investigation concluded that the attack occurred after Amber exposed part of her body outside the vehicle. The lioness responded in a typical predatory manner to movement within reach. Following the incident, the reserve implemented stricter enforcement, increased patrol presence, and reinforced visitor compliance with safety protocols. Footage from the incident was held by authorities due to high graphic content. It was August 29, 2016. Along the Brooks River corridor in Alaska's Katmai region, late summer heat hung over shoulder-to-shoulder crowds lining the gravel bars as thousands of salmon surged upstream. Elevated platforms filled early, rangers repeated spacing reminders, and the constant churn of water and cameras masked how quickly a routine viewing day could tip past control. Dax Lorne was 26 and ran a small wildlife channel that focused on minimizing perceived animal danger. He worked part-time as a video editor and used most of his savings for trips designed to generate close-range wildlife footage. His earlier clips showed him near bison in Yellowstone and black bears in Montana, positioning proximity as controlled exposure rather than risk. Engagement had slowed over the past year. Katmai, known for high densities of coastal brown bears during salmon season, offered access to animals in open daylight along managed viewing areas. He was organized with equipment and travel logistics. He secured permits, reviewed park guidelines, and booked a guided day group along the Brooks River corridor. His filming style relied on narrowing the distance without triggering an obvious reaction. He had previously recorded bears that appeared indifferent to human presence when people remained inside designated zones, and he attempted to replicate that visual framing. The Brooks River ran shallow over rounded cobble, dense with sockeye salmon moving upstream, while multiple bears fished along established stretches of current. Coastal brown bears in Katmai commonly weigh between 700 and 1,200 pounds by late August. During hyperphagia, they feed for extended periods and may react abruptly if their fishing is interrupted at close range. A bear can cover 20 feet in roughly a second at short burst speed. In serious maulings, documented injuries frequently involve crushing trauma to the head, neck, and upper torso due to jaw strength and body mass, rather than prolonged predation behavior. That morning, Dax joined a ranger-led group and attended a mandatory safety briefing. The ranger emphasized maintaining distance, remaining within marked viewing boundaries, and never descending onto active gravel bars where bears were fishing. Visitors were instructed that bears focused on salmon should not be approached, even if they appeared calm. As the group continued downstream, Dax slowed and allowed distance to form between himself and the others. Across a narrow channel, a large bear stood mid-current, pinning salmon against submerged rocks. From the approved corridor distance, the bear continued fishing. Dax stepped off the marked area and descended the uneven bank, boots shifting in loose gravel. His camera remained raised. At approximately 30 feet, he tossed a small pebble toward the water. The bear paused, lifted its head, oriented toward the shoreline, and resumed fishing. He moved closer along the shoreline, reducing the gap to an estimated 20 to 25 feet. On the recovered footage, the bear's fishing rhythm changed. It lifted its head repeatedly and rotated its body angle toward shore. The interval between salmon strikes lengthened. Dax continued forward, still recording. The charge began abruptly. The bear dropped its head and surged from the shallows in a direct line. Gravel displaced under its forepaws. The distance closed in less than a second. Dax attempted to step backward while holding the phone. His right heel slid in unstable stones, and he fell onto his side. The bear collided with him chest first, knocking him flat. Its jaws closed over the right side of his head and upper neck. The recorded audio captured a heavy impact and scraping against rock. Witnesses across the river later described a single brief shout, The bear released and immediately re-engaged with a second bite directed to the back of the skull. Based on documented bear attack patterns, the force likely resulted from jaw compression combined with downward body weight rather than tearing. Movement from Dax became disorganized within seconds. The mauling remained brief. The bear stood over him and delivered additional downward bites to the cranial and upper cervical region. There was no prolonged feeding behavior. Blood spread rapidly across the gravel beneath his head. The active contact phase, from impact to disengagement, lasted under half a minute. The bear stepped away several feet, remained oriented toward the area briefly, then returned toward the river and resumed fishing within visible range. Emergency services were called immediately. Rangers staged with deterrent equipment and medical gear and waited until the bear had fully moved off before approaching. They reached Dax in approximately 12 minutes. On assessment, he had no pulse and was not breathing. Visible injuries included severe cranial trauma and extensive damage to the upper neck. Field responders documented depressed skull fractures and significant cervical instability. Resuscitation was not initiated due to injuries incompatible with survival. The medical examiner documented extensive skull fractures, catastrophic brain injury, and upper cervical spine disruption, consistent with high-force blunt and bite trauma. The cause of death was listed as massive cranial and cervical trauma resulting from a bear mauling. Rangers recovered Dax's phone from the gravel near his right hand. The footage showed him crossing the viewing boundary, closing the distance, and the charge. The incident received limited regional coverage and was classified as a visitor distance fatality during peak salmon activity after a violation of designated viewing areas. The bear was not destroyed, consistent with policy for defensive encounters in food-focused contexts. Access to that corridor section was temporarily restricted. By evening, salmon continued upstream and bears remained along the same stretch.